Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight we drift quietly into a world of cold fjords, smoky longhouses, and the slow rhythm of life in Viking Age Norway. Imagine the gentle creak of wood beneath your feet as a narrow longship glides between dark mountains rising straight from the sea. The water is calm tonight, reflecting a sky that seems almost too large for the rugged land beneath it. You sit among traders, farmers, and a few quiet warriors, all watching the shoreline approach as the sail flutters softly in the northern wind. And here is a small reality check. If you are actually arriving here in the year 900, there is a very good chance you probably would not survive your first winter without help. Life here is beautiful, yes, but it's also demanding, cold, and very serious about who gets to stay. Still tonight, you are lucky. Tonight you arrive prepared, curious, and warmly wrapped in the quiet safety of imagination. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, let me know where you are listening from and what the local time is where you are. It is always fascinating to see how far these little bedtime journeys travel across the world. Now dim the lights. The sail above you loosens with a soft snap as the wind fades. One of the sailors pulls the rope through his hands and lowers the cloth slowly, while another man guides the longship toward the rocky shoreline. The fjord is narrower here than it first appeared. Tall cliffs rise on both sides, dark with pine forests that smell faintly of resin and damp earth. A waterfall spills down one distant cliff like a thin silver thread. This land can feel empty at first glance, but it's not empty at all. Small farms cling to narrow patches of soil where the mountains relax just enough to allow grass and barley to grow. Smoke drifts upward from turf-roofed buildings that sit low against the ground as if they are trying to hide from the wind. You hear sheep somewhere on the hillside. Their bells clink softly in the evening air. This is Norway in the 900s. And while many people imagine Viking life as endless raiding and dramatic battles, the quiet truth is that most people here are farmers. A widely accepted historical understanding is that the majority of Norse people spent their lives tending fields, raising animals, and managing small family farms. The famous longships and raids did exist, of course, but they were only a small piece of everyday life. The ship finally touches the shore with a gentle scrape of wood on stone. You step out carefully onto wet rocks, steadying yourself as the cold water laps around your boots. The air feels sharper here than it did at sea. There is a crisp northern bite to it that wakes you up immediately. The sailors begin pulling the longship farther onto land. Longships are light for their size, cleverly designed so crews can drag them onto beaches rather than needing large harbours. You help for a moment, gripping the smooth wooden hull while everyone leans together and pushes. The boat slides forward with a grinding sound. Someone laughs. Someone else exhales in relief, and then the fjord becomes quiet again. A narrow dirt path leads away from the shore and winds toward the farmstead you saw from the water. From here, you can see the buildings more clearly. There is one long structure with a curved roof covered in grass and turf. This is the longhouse. Nearby stand smaller sheds for animals, storage huts, and a fenced area where goats wander lazily. A thin column of smoke rises from a hole in the longhouse roof. You begin walking. The ground beneath your feet is uneven and soft. Norway's farming land is not wide and easy like the plains farther south in Europe. Instead, farms exist wherever people manage to carve out space between mountains, forest and sea. Because of this geography, Viking farms are usually small family operations. Each household works hard to survive. A curious historical detail often mentioned by archaeologists is that many Viking farms also relied heavily on dried fish and preserved foods because the growing season was short. Winter could last a very long time here. As you approach the longhouse, the smell of wood smoke grows stronger. It mixes with the faint scent of animals, damp grass, and cooking stew. Not unpleasant, just earthy, honest. A dog appears first. It trots towards you with cautious curiosity, tail wagging slowly. Dogs were common on Viking farms and served as guards, hunters, and companions. You crouch slightly and the dog sniffs your hand. Approved. Behind the dog, a farmer steps out of the longhouse doorway. He squints toward the shore, probably already aware that a boat arrived. Travellers are always interesting news in small communities. His clothing is simple but sturdy. A wool tunic tied at the waist, trousers tucked into leather boots, and a thick cloak fastened with a metal brooch. Wool is extremely important here. Most Viking clothing is made from wool because sheep thrive in this environment. Linen exists too, but wool handles the cold northern climate much better. The farmer raises a hand in greeting. You return the gesture. Conversations in this world begin calmly. No rushing, no shouting, just quiet observation first. He gestures toward the house, inviting you closer. The longhouse is larger than you expected. Nearly 30 metres long, perhaps, though sizes vary depending on the wealth of the family. Inside will be warmth, animals' tools, sleeping benches, and a fire that burns nearly all day. But before you step inside, you pause for a moment to take in the landscape behind you. The fjord stretches quietly into the distance, reflecting fading daylight. Pine trees whisper in the wind. Somewhere farther down the valley, another farm's smoke curls upward. Life here is scattered but connected. People rely on neighbours' trade and seasonal gatherings to maintain community, and yet the landscape always reminds you who is truly in charge. Nature. Storms can arrive suddenly in these fjords. Crops can fail. Winters can stretch longer than expected. Because of this, Viking society places enormous importance on preparation, reputation, and cooperation. A curious tidbit that historians sometimes enjoy mentioning is that Viking households often stored huge quantities of dried food and preserved butter in underground storage pits to survive the winter months. Preparation is not optional here, it is survival. As you step toward the doorway, the warmth from inside brushes your face. The smell of smoke and cooking meat drifts outward in a comforting wave. You duck slightly beneath the wooden doorway beam and enter. Your eyes take a moment to adjust. Firelight flickers across wooden walls and thick support beams that hold the roof above. The interior is wide but dim, with benches along the sides and a long fire pit running through the centre. A few chickens wander near the far wall. Yes, animals sometimes share space in the longhouse during colder months. Practical. Efficient. A woman stirs a pot over the fire, while two children sit nearby carving small pieces of wood into shapes that look like toy animals. The fire crackles softly. Smoke drifts upward toward the roof vent, but not all of it escapes, giving the air that familiar smoky smell Viking homes were known for. Scholars continue to debate exactly how smoky longhouses became during daily life. Some reconstructions suggest it could be quite thick at times, while others argue ventilation systems improved conditions more than we once believed. Either way, your eyes water slightly at first, but you quickly grow used to it. A bench is offered to you near the fire. You sit down slowly. The warmth spreads through your hands. Outside evening settles quietly over the fjord valley, and without realising it, you have just stepped into the calm, demanding and surprisingly ordinary world of Viking Age Norway. The warmth from the fire slowly settles into your bones as you sit on the wooden bench. Outside, the evening air grows colder by the minute, but inside the longhouse there is a steady rhythm of quiet activity. The woman tending the pot stirs slowly, occasionally adding a handful of something from a wooden bowl. A faint smell of onions, herbs, and simmering meat drifts through the smoky air. You notice how the entire building seems designed for survival rather than comfort. Thick wooden beams support the roof. The walls are packed with timber clay and turf to keep out the wind. Along both sides of the room run long wooden platforms covered in furs. These benches serve as seating during the day and sleeping places at night. The longhouse is not just a house, it is the centre of the entire farm. You glance around and begin to notice small details everywhere. A rack of tools hangs near the doorway. Bundles of dried herbs are tied to a beam. Several clay and wooden containers sit neatly along the wall. Everything has a place. Nothing is wasted here. A commonly accepted historical fact is that Viking Age farms were usually run as self-sufficient households. Families produced most of what they needed themselves. Clothing tools, food, shelter, and equipment were all created within the farm or traded locally. In a place like this, independence was not a luxury. It was the only way to survive. The farmer who greeted you earlier settles onto the bench nearby. He studies you for a moment with calm curiosity. People in these small fjord communities are used to strangers arriving by ship. Traders, travellers, and distant relatives often move along the coastline. The sea is the highway of this world, and that is why the place where a farm is built matters so much. Earlier, when the boat approached the shore, you probably noticed something important about the location. The farm sits slightly above the fjord on a gentle slope that receives sunlight for much of the day. Behind the buildings rises a forest that offers wood for construction and fuel. Nearby streams provide fresh water. Choosing the right location for a farm in Viking Age Norway is one of the most critical decisions a family can make. The growing season here is short. Soil can be thin. Strong winds from the sea can damage crops if the land is too exposed. So when a new farm is established, families carefully select land that balances protection, sunlight, water, access, and pasture for animals. You can imagine early settlers walking this valley generations ago, studying the land in much the same way you are now. Historians generally agree that many Viking Age farms were built on sites that had been used for centuries, sometimes even since the Iron Age. Good land was rare and valuable, so once a successful farm location was discovered, families often stayed there for many generations. Outside the doorway, you hear the distant bleating of sheep again. Livestock needs space to graze, especially during the warmer months. Around this farm, narrow strips of pasture stretch between rocky hillsides. During summer, animals are often taken higher into the mountains where grass grows fresh and thick. This seasonal movement of animals is something Norwegians will continue doing for more than 1,000 years. The woman near the fire finally lifts the lid from the pot and tastes the stew with a wooden spoon. She nods slightly satisfied. The children watch you with open curiosity. Visitors bring stories, and stories are rare treasures in places like this. You begin to notice how the interior space of the longhouse reflects the structure of Viking society itself. The central fire runs along the middle of the building, creating both warmth and light. Around it sits the family and anyone who belongs under this roof. Closer to the far end of the house, you see a partition where animals will be sheltered during the colder months. Keeping livestock inside the building during winter provides warmth and protection for both humans and animals. It might sound unusual to modern ears, but in the Viking world, practicality always wins over personal comfort. An interesting and slightly quirky historical detail is that archaeologists have discovered traces of small animal stalls built directly into longhouses. This means cow, sheep and goats sometimes lived only a few meters away from where people slept. The smell was probably not subtle, but in a freezing Norwegian winter, a little extra warmth from livestock could make a real difference. The farmer gestures toward the valley outside, as if explaining something about the land. Even without understanding every word, the meaning is clear enough. The land gives, but the land also demands. Fields must be cleared of stones. Soil must be turned with simple wooden ploughs tipped with iron. Seeds must be planted at exactly the right moment when the frost finally retreats. Barley is one of the most common crops grown here. It survives the cooler northern climate better than many other grains. Barley becomes bread porridge and, most importantly, ale. Ale is not just a drink. It is a daily staple and often safer to consume than untreated water. The farmer chuckles softly while describing something about the last harvest. You imagine the effort it must take to grow enough grain in such a rugged place. Historians still discuss exactly how productive Viking farms were in this region. Some researchers believe yields were modest and required careful storage planning to survive winter. Others think certain fertile valleys may have produced surprisingly strong harvests in good years. Either way, farming here is never easy. The children have moved closer now, pretending to continue carving wood, while clearly listening to every word being spoken. One of them holds up the small figure he has been carving. It looks like a tiny horse. Toys like these are sometimes found during archaeological excavations of Viking settlements. Simple wooden animals, miniature boats, and carved game pieces remind us that childhood existed here just as it does anywhere else. Even in a harsh world, people make time for play. The fire crackles again, and the woman begins placing bowls onto the wooden table near the centre of the room. Dinner is almost ready. The farmer stands and stretches his back, clearly feeling the weight of a long day of work. Farming in this land means constant labour. There are fences to repair animals, to watch tools to maintain, and weather to monitor. But the location of this farm gives it one enormous advantage. The fjord itself. You remember the calm water you arrived on earlier? That water connects this small valley to the entire Viking world. Ships can travel along these coastlines for thousands of kilometres, linking isolated farms into trade networks that stretch from the British Isles to the Baltic Sea and beyond. A remote farm is never truly isolated as long as the sea remains open. The farmer opens the door briefly and the cool evening air spills inside. The sky outside is already fading into deep blue twilight. Stars will appear soon. You realise that today you have only just begun to understand how carefully every element of Viking life is balanced around land, water and survival. And tomorrow morning, when the household wakes again, the true rhythm of this farm will begin to reveal itself. The fire burns lower as dinner ends, and the longhouse grows quieter for a while. Outside, night settles gently over the fjord valley. A few stars appear above the mountains, bright and steady in the clear northern sky. Inside, the family moves slowly through familiar routines. Bowls are rinsed with water from a wooden bucket. Tools are returned to their hooks. The children whisper to each other, while the dog curls near the warm stones of the hearth. You begin to understand something important about Viking life. A farm like this is never truly finished. Buildings are repaired, constantly roofs replaced walls, strengthened new sheds added whenever the family grows or the needs of the animals change. The longhouse itself, the heart of the farm, is the result of careful planning and hard labour. Earlier today, when you first stepped through the doorway, you saw only the warmth and the smoke and the firelight. Now you begin to imagine how this structure came to exist. You picture yourself arriving here months earlier before the house was built. The land would have looked rough and uneven, scattered with stones and small trees. The first step in building any Viking farmstead was clearing enough space to create a stable foundation. Men, women, and older children all helped with this work. Trees were cut using iron axes, their trunks dragged aside for later use as beams or fence posts. Stones were pulled from the ground and stacked into rough boundary walls that still line many old Scandinavian fields today. A widely recognised historical fact is that Viking Age builders relied heavily on timber construction. Norway's forests provided strong pine and oak that could be shaped into beams, planks and posts, using surprisingly sophisticated woodworking techniques. Once the ground was cleared, the shape of the longhouse would be marked directly on the soil. Longhouses were usually rectangular with gently curved walls and a slightly arched roof. Some stretched nearly 30 metres long, though smaller families might build shorter homes. The farmer here likely chose a spot that slopes slightly downhill toward the fjord. This helps rainwater drain away from the building and protects the house from flooding during heavy storms. You imagine the next stage of construction. Large wooden posts are driven deep into the ground to create the main skeleton of the building. These vertical supports hold up the roof and define the long interior hall that runs through the centre of the house. Between these posts, walls are built using wooden planks or woven branches covered with clay and turf. This method creates thick insulation that keeps warmth inside during winter and blocks strong coastal winds. Roof beams are lifted into place using ropes and careful teamwork. The roof itself is layered with birch bark and heavy sod blocks cut directly from the earth. Over time, grass grows across the top, turning the entire roof into a living green blanket. From a distance, Viking houses often blend into the surrounding landscape because of these turf roofs. An unusual little detail that archaeologists have discovered is that some longhouses show signs of decorative carvings on doorposts and beams. These carvings might include simple patterns or protective symbols meant to bring luck to the household. Even ordinary farms sometimes carried quiet traces of art. Inside the house, the floor is usually packed earth. In some areas, wooden planks may be added, especially near the central fire where people gather most often. The fire pit itself is one of the most important features of the building. Stones line the centre of the longhouse, creating a narrow hearth that runs along the middle of the room. This fire provides heat light and a place for cooking, but it also fills the air with smoke. You remember how your eyes watered when you first entered earlier tonight. That experience was probably quite common for Viking families. Smoke slowly rises through vents in the roof, but not all of it escapes immediately. Over time, the interior beams become dark with soot, and the smell of smoke settles into clothing, hair, and blankets. Historians still discuss how smoky longhouses truly were during daily life. Some experiments with reconstructed buildings suggest the smoke eventually forms a layer near the roof, while the air below remains relatively clear. Other researchers believe conditions might have been far harsher, especially during long winters when fires burned constantly. Either way, people living here would have grown used to it. By the time the structure itself is complete, the family still has many tasks ahead. Sleeping benches must be built along the walls. Storage chests are carved to hold clothing and valuables. Hooks and shelves are added for tools and food supplies. Gradually, the empty hall transforms into a living home. You picture the first night after construction finished. A new fire crackles in the hearth. Fresh straw covers the sleeping platforms. The smell of new timber fills the air. Outside the fjord reflects the moonlight just as it does tonight. The farmer's family would have gathered around the fire much like they are now. Perhaps they shared a meal of porridge or fish stew. Perhaps someone told a story about distant relatives who sailed west across the sea. A fascinating historical observation made by researchers is that longhouses were not just homes, but also social centres. Important guests, travellers, and sometimes entire communities gathered inside during feasts or celebrations. In larger settlements, the longhouse of a local leader could become the focal point of political life. But here in this quiet fjord valley, the house serves a simpler purpose. It shelters the family. The woman who cooked dinner earlier now spreads fresh straw across part of the floor near the animal partition. Soon the goats will be brought inside for the night. The temperature will drop sharply once darkness fully settles over the valley. The farmer adjusts a wooden beam near the doorway, checking its stability with practiced hands. You notice how naturally everyone here understands the structure of the building. They know where the wind might slip through, which beams creak during storms, and how to repair damage before it becomes dangerous. Living in a wooden house surrounded by forests and snow requires constant attention. One of the children walks over to the doorway and peeks outside. Cold air rushes in, briefly carrying the scent of pine and distant water. The stars above the fjord are brighter now. You realise that tomorrow will bring more work for this household. Fences must be checked, animals fed, and tools prepared for the coming days of farm labour. But tonight, inside this sturdy longhouse built by careful hands, the family rests safely beneath its turf-covered roof, and the slow rhythm of Viking life continues. Morning arrives quietly in the fjord valley. At first you notice only a faint grey light slipping through the smoke hole in the roof. The fire in the centre of the longhouse has burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft orange glow across the packed earth floor. Around you the household still sleeps, wrapped in wool blankets and animal furs. Then the dog lifts its head. A moment later, one of the goats shuffles inside the animal partition, knocking lightly against a wooden rail. The sound echoes softly through the dim room. Day has begun. You shift slightly on the bench where you slept. The surface is firm but not uncomfortable. Layers of wool and sheepskin soften the wood beneath you. During the night, the longhouse stayed warmer than the outside air, though the early morning chill now creeps slowly into the room. Across the hall, the woman of the house is already awake. She moves quietly, stepping carefully around sleeping children as she kneels beside the hearth. With practiced motions, she pushes fresh pieces of firewood onto the glowing coals. A small breath of air through a hollow reed brings the embers back to life. Flames slowly rise. The smell of wood smoke spreads through the hall, again familiar and steady. Archaeological studies of Viking homes show that the hearth fire was rarely allowed to go out completely. Keeping a bed of embers alive overnight made it much easier to start the next day's fire without wasting precious fuel. Outside, the sky grows brighter. Through the open doorway, you glimpse pale morning light touching the slopes of the mountains. The fjord below reflects the colour of cold steel, still and silent. The farmer stirs next. He sits upright, slowly rubbing his eyes before swinging his feet to the floor. Like everyone else in the house, he slept in simple clothing. Vikings did not maintain large wardrobes for sleeping and waking. Clothing was valuable and practical. He stretches his back and steps outside, briefly returning a moment later with a breath of icy air following him into the house. Soon the entire longhouse begins to wake. The children sit up and begin whispering. One reaches for the small carved horse you saw last night. The dog stretches and shakes its fur, sending dust and straw into the air. You hear chickens clucking outside. Morning in a Viking household does not involve rushing. The rhythm is steady and purposeful. Everyone knows what the day requires. One widely accepted detail about daily life in the Viking Age is that households functioned as tightly coordinated teams. Each member of the family, including children, contributed to the work needed to maintain the farm. The woman places a heavy iron pot over the newly revived fire. Inside goes water-crushed grains and a handful of dried berries. Breakfast will be simple. Barley porridge appears frequently in archaeological food remains from Viking settlements. It provided steady energy and could be prepared quickly before a long day of labour. The farmer steps toward a wooden chest near the wall and removes a cloak, fastening it with a round bronze brooch at his shoulder. The metal catches the morning firelight with a dull shine. You notice the brooch carefully. Small items like brooches, belt buckles and beads were common personal possessions in Viking households. Even ordinary farmers sometimes owned decorative metalwork, often traded from distant regions. A curious discovery from several Norwegian burial sites is that many brooches were crafted with intricate geometric patterns, suggesting that even everyday objects carried a quiet appreciation for craftsmanship. Meanwhile, the children begin their morning tasks. One gathers small pieces of wood for the fire. Another carries a bucket toward the doorway, preparing to fetch water from the nearby stream. Children here learn responsibility very early. There are no long years of sheltered childhood in the Viking world. Skills are passed down through observation and participation. Outside the longhouse, the valley is fully awake now. Thin mist rises from the fjord. Sheep wander slowly across the hillside pasture, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Somewhere in the forest, a raven calls its harsh voice echoing through the trees. You step outside for a moment and feel the sharp freshness of the northern morning. The ground is damp with dew. The scent of pine and wet earth fills your lungs. Researchers studying climate records suggest that the early medieval period may have included slightly warmer conditions in parts of Scandinavia than today. Some scholars think this climate shift helped support farming expansion during the Viking Age, though the exact impact remains uncertain. Even so, mornings here remain brisk. Back inside, the porridge is nearly ready. The woman stirs the pot slowly while steam curls upward toward the roof vent. She adds a splash of fermented milk, thick and slightly sour, which gives the porridge extra flavour. An unusual little detail preserved in Norse texts is that sour dairy products such as skyr and cultured milk were common foods in Scandinavia. These fermented foods lasted longer than fresh milk and provided important nutrients. Bowls are placed along the wooden table. The farmer sits the children gather and you are handed a carved wooden spoon. The porridge is warm and hearty. Not luxurious, but comforting. In a land where winter lasts many months, simple hot food carries its own quiet satisfaction. Conversation remains calm and unhurried. Plans for the day begin to form. Animals must be checked first. Sheep and goats need fresh pasture. Fences require inspection after last night's wind. A small fishing net left near the fjord will also need attention. Every task connects to survival. Yet there is no sense of panic in the room. People here understand the rhythm of their environment. The seasons guide their work, and each morning follows patterns learned over generations. The fire crackles softly while sunlight finally reaches the doorway. You realise that this peaceful morning, simple and steady, represents the true heartbeat of Viking Age Norway. Not the battles or the long voyages, but the quiet beginning of another day on a fjord-side farm. After breakfast, the longhouse slowly empties as everyone moves into the crisp morning air. The fjord valley now glows with pale sunlight. Mist that once hovered above the water drifts away, revealing the dark mirror of the fjord stretching between steep mountain walls. You step outside with the others and immediately feel the bite of northern air against your skin. This is the moment you realise how important clothing is in Viking Age Norway. Without the right layers, the cold here would drain your strength within hours. The farmer pulls a thicker wool cloak around his shoulders before heading toward the animal pens. The woman tightens a woven belt around her waist and ties a linen headscarf over her hair. Even the children wrap themselves in small cloaks as they begin their morning chores. You look down at your own clothing and begin to notice how carefully each piece is designed. The base layer is a linen tunic that rests lightly against the skin. Linen breathes well and dries faster than wool, making it comfortable for daily wear. Over this sits a thicker wool tunic that traps warmth close to the body. Wool was one of the most important materials in Viking society. Archaeological textile fragments recovered from graves and settlements reveal that Norse people were skilled at spinning, weaving and dyeing wool into durable clothing. The fabric you are wearing feels dense and slightly rough, but it holds heat remarkably well. Your trousers are also wool tied at the waist with a simple cord. They tuck into leather boots that have been stitched carefully by hand. The soles are thick enough to handle rough ground, but flexible enough for walking across uneven terrain. Leatherwork was another essential skill within Viking households. Shoes wore out quickly in this environment, especially during wet seasons, so repairing and replacing them was a constant task. You pull your cloak tighter as a breeze flows down the valley. Cloaks are one of the most recognisable elements of Viking clothing. They are usually fastened at the shoulder with a brooch and can be wrapped around the body for extra warmth. Some cloaks are simple and undyed. Others display subtle colours created using natural plant dyes. Archaeological finds have shown that Viking textiles were often far more colourful than modern people imagine. Plants such as woadmadder root and certain lichens could produce shades of blue, red, yellow and green. So although movies often show Vikings dressed only in dull browns and greys, real clothing sometimes displayed surprisingly vibrant colours. One interesting observation made by textile historians is that even small communities in Norway appear to have maintained sophisticated weaving traditions. Loom weights and spindle whorls are commonly found during excavations of Viking farmsteads. This means spinning thread and weaving cloth were constant activities in many households. The woman from the longhouse now steps outside carrying a basket of wool fibres that she will spin later in the day. Even while other work continues, tasks like spinning thread never truly stop. The children run ahead toward the animal pens, their boots thumping softly across the damp grass. You notice their clothing mirrors the adults, only smaller and patched more often. Fabric was valuable, so worn garments were repaired repeatedly before finally being cut into smaller pieces for other uses. There's also a small but curious detail about Viking clothing that often surprises modern audiences. Some Norse garments included decorative tablet weaving along the edges. This technique produced narrow bands with intricate patterns that could be sewn onto sleeves or hems. These small decorations allowed families to display skill and creativity even in everyday clothing. As the farmer opens the gate to the animal enclosure, the sheep begin to move slowly toward fresh grass outside the fence. The sun climbs a little higher now, warming the valley just enough to soften the morning chill. You notice the farmer's belt next. Leather belts were more than simple accessories. They held small knives, pouches, and tools that people needed throughout the day. Most adults carried a utility knife called a seax, or a small working blade used for cutting rope, preparing food, shaping wood, and countless other tasks. It was an everyday tool rather than a weapon. You realise how practical everything about Viking clothing is. Nothing here exists purely for decoration. Every piece serves a purpose connected to weather work and movement. Researchers examining preserved clothing fragments suggest that Viking garments were often layered carefully to adapt to changing temperatures throughout the day. This layering allowed people to work outdoors for long hours, even when conditions shifted quickly. In a place where cold winds can sweep down from the mountains without warning, adaptability matters. One of the children runs past you holding a wooden bucket, laughing as the dog chases behind. You notice the boy's tunic is secured with a simple bone pin, rather than a metal brooch. Metal objects required skilled smithing and therefore held greater value, so simpler materials were often used for children's clothing. A small detail like that reveals a lot about daily priorities. Metal was precious. Bonewood and leather filled the gaps. Meanwhile, the woman begins setting up a small wooden distaff near the doorway. She attaches loose wool fibres to it and starts spinning thread using a drop spindle. The motion is calm and rhythmic. Thread forms slowly as the spindle twists in her fingers. This quiet work might continue for hours while she supervises other tasks around the farm.
Chess.
Experts studying textile production estimate that creating enough cloth for a household required enormous effort. Spinning alone could consume hundreds of hours each year. Clothing did not come easily. Every thread carried time and labour within it. You pull your cloak tighter again as a cool wind moves through the valley. Despite the sunlight, the air remains sharp and clean. Clothing like this allows people to live here. Without it, the fjord landscape would quickly remind you who truly controls the environment. The farmer glances toward the mountains, where thin clouds drift across the peaks. Weather can change quickly in this part of the world. But for now, the sky remains clear and the day ahead promises another stretch of steady farm work beneath the northern sun. The morning work moves steadily forward, and before long, the quiet hunger that comes from fresh air and activity begins to return. The simple bowl of porridge earlier has warmed your stomach, but it was never meant to last the entire morning. Life on a Viking farm demands frequent small meals rather than grand feasts. You notice the woman of the house returning to the longhouse with a small wooden basket balanced on her arm. Inside are flat pieces of barley bread wrapped in cloth. She sets them on the table beside a bowl of thick butter and a small pot of preserved fish. The longhouse fills again with the comforting smell of food. Meals in Viking Age Norway are rarely elaborate, but they are nourishing. Much of daily cooking revolves around ingredients that can survive long storage through the long northern winter. Archaeological studies of food remains from Viking settlements show that barley formed the backbone of most meals. It could be ground into flour for bread, cooked into porridge, or fermented into ale. Barley is dependable. In a harsh climate, dependability matters more than luxury. You sit again near the central hearth as the farmer slices the bread with a small knife from his belt. The blade is sharp, but well worn, clearly used many times each day. The bread itself is dense and slightly dark in colour. Barley bread does not rise like modern wheat bread. Instead, it remains flat and firm, more like a thick cracker. You spread butter across the surface and take a bite. It tastes earthy and satisfying, especially when paired with a strip of dried fish from the fjord. Fishing plays a major role in the diet here. The cold waters of Norway provide cod herring and other fish that can be dried or salted for storage. Many coastal farms depend on fish as much as grain. One observation made by researchers studying Viking food is that dried fish was often traded widely across Scandinavia because it could last for months without spoiling. It became a valuable commodity. The farmer gestures towards the fjord as if explaining how the catch has been recently. Nets and lines placed in the water yesterday may already hold fish waiting to be collected. While you eat, the children dip pieces of bread into a small wooden bowl of honey. Honey was one of the few natural sweeteners available in the Viking world. Wild bee nests were sometimes harvested, and some farms may have even kept early forms of beehives. Honey served another important purpose as well. It was used to produce mead, a fermented drink made from honey and water that appears frequently in Norse stories and celebrations. A small but intriguing detail from Viking archaeology is that traces of fermented honey drinks have been discovered in drinking vessels from burial sites. This suggests that mead held cultural importance beyond simple refreshment. Still mead is not part of this quiet morning meal. Instead, the family drinks a thin ale poured from a clay jug. The alcohol content is mild, and the drink is safer than untreated water that might carry harmful bacteria. Weak ale appears to have been common at many meals. You sip from a wooden cup and notice how the slightly sour flavour pairs well with the bread. Across the room, the woman adds more wood to the fire while keeping an eye on a pot slowly simmering for the midday meal. Cooking in the Viking world often takes place in stages throughout the day. Food rarely appears suddenly. Instead, it develops gradually over hours of slow heating and preparation. A fascinating discovery from excavated Viking cooking areas is the presence of iron cooking hooks suspended above hearth fires. These hooks allowed pots to hang at different heights, so food could simmer without burning. You glance upward and see a similar hook above the fire here. The pot hanging from it releases a faint smell of herbs and broth that promises something warm later. Meanwhile, the farmer begins preparing to check the fishing nets. He tightens his belt and reaches for a thick wool cap hanging near the doorway. Even in daylight, the wind off the fjord can be sharp. The children finish their bread quickly and rush outside again, their energy already restored. Watching them run down the path toward the shoreline reminds you how deeply the sea shapes life in this valley. The fjord is not simply scenery. It is a pantry, a highway, and sometimes a source of danger. Scholars examining coastal settlements often note that Viking communities position themselves carefully along navigable waterways. Access to fishing and boat travel was essential for survival. Without the fjord, farms like this would feel far more isolated. Before leaving, the farmer lifts a small wooden chest near the wall and removes a handful of dried herbs. He crushes them gently into the pot over the fire. Herbs such as angelica, thyme, and wild garlic were commonly gathered from surrounding forests and meadows. They added flavour to otherwise simple meals. One unusual culinary detail sometimes mentioned in Norse texts is that people occasionally used seaweed as both seasoning and emergency food during difficult seasons. The ocean truly fed every part of Viking life. You finish the last piece of bread and step outside once more. The valley is brighter now. Sunlight sparkles across the water while seabirds circle overhead. The farmer and children are already moving towards the shoreline, where yesterday's nets wait in the cold fjord. Behind you, the longhouse stands quiet and solid against the hillside. Its turf roof glows green in the morning light. Inside, the fire continues to burn steadily, and the slow preparation of the next meal has already begun. The path toward the fields curves gently away from the longhouse, following the natural shape of the hillside as it slopes down toward the fjord. The ground beneath your boots is soft with morning moisture, and each step releases the quiet scent of damp soil and crushed grass. Ahead of you, the farmer walks with steady familiarity. His eyes move constantly across the land, checking small details you might easily miss. A leaning fence post here, a patch of disturbed soil there, a cloud drifting slowly over the mountains that might hint at changing weather later in the day. On a Viking farm, the land is never ignored. You soon reach the first of the cultivated fields. They are not wide open plains like farmland in many parts of the modern world. Instead, they appear as narrow strips of earth carefully cleared between rocks and gentle slopes. Norway does not offer large areas of easy agricultural ground. Much of the country is mountainous forested or too cold for reliable crops. Because of this, Viking farmers worked smaller fields very carefully, making the most of every patch of usable soil. Archaeological surveys across Scandinavia show that many Viking Age farms relied heavily on barley as their primary grain. Barley grows faster than wheat and tolerates colder conditions, making it far better suited for northern climates. The field before you now contains short green stalks moving lightly in the wind. Barley. You crouch slightly and run your hand across the tops of the plants. They feel soft and flexible, though the roots grip the earth firmly. Planting these fields required considerable effort. Before any seeds could be sown, the soil had to be cleared of stones. Viking farmers spent countless hours pulling rocks from the ground, piling them along field edges to form rough boundary walls that still exist in parts of rural Norway today. You glance toward the edges of the field and see one of these stone lines stretching quietly across the slope. Each stone represents work done by hands many centuries ago. The farmer stops beside a wooden plough resting near the edge of the field. It is simple but sturdy. The blade is tipped with iron, allowing it to cut through soil more effectively than earlier wooden tools. Early medieval ploughing technology improved steadily during the Viking Age. Iron-tipped ploughs made it easier to prepare fields for planting, though the work remained physically demanding. The farmer gestures toward the harness rope attached to the plough. Soon you notice a pair of small oxen grazing nearby. These animals provide the strength needed to pull the plough through heavy ground. Without them, turning soil across these rocky fields would take far longer. Many Viking farms kept cattle not only for milk and meat, but also as working animals for agricultural tasks. The farmer guides the oxen into position while you watch the plough sink slowly into the soil. As the animals begin moving forward, the blade cuts a narrow line through the earth, turning the soil over in long, rough strips. The process is slow but steady. Row after row forms behind the plough, each preparing the field for planting or refreshing soil that has already supported earlier crops. Agriculture in Viking Norway followed seasonal rhythms that rarely changed. Spring meant ploughing and planting. Summer demanded weeding, tending, and protecting crops from grazing animals. Autumn brought the crucial harvest. Winter offered only brief rest before preparation began again. Researchers studying pollen samples preserved in ancient soil layers have found evidence showing how farming expanded gradually across parts of Norway during the Viking Age. These samples reveal increasing traces of barley and other cultivated plants appearing in areas that were once dense forest. This suggests that Viking communities slowly cleared more land as their populations grew. While the farmer works the plough, the children gather small stones from the field, tossing them into a growing pile near the boundary wall. Their work may look small, but removing stones protects the plough blade and improves the soil for planting. Everyone contributes here. Even the youngest members of the household help shape the farm's future harvest. You notice something else along the edge of the field, a patch of tall plants growing near a wooden fence. The farmer walks over and plucks one leaf carefully before handing it to you. Angelica. This hardy plant grows naturally in northern climates and serves several uses in Viking life. The stalks could be eaten, the roots used in herbal remedies, and the plant itself sometimes added flavour to meals. One intriguing discovery made by archaeobotanists is that Angelica appears so frequently near Viking farm sites that some experts suspect people deliberately cultivated it close to their homes. It may have been one of the earliest garden plants in Scandinavia. The wind picks up slightly as clouds begin drifting across the fjord. Shadows move slowly over the hillside fields. You watch the barley ripple like green water. Despite the peaceful scene, farming here always carries uncertainty. Weather can change suddenly. A late frost might damage young plants. Too much rain can flood low fields. Too little rain might weaken crops before harvest. Specialists studying early medieval agriculture continue to examine how Viking farmers adapted to these challenges. Some believe crop rotation was practiced in limited forms, while others think most farms relied more heavily on manure from livestock to restore soil nutrients. Either way, success required careful observation and experience. The farmer pauses and wipes soil from his hands. He studies the sky again, measuring the shifting clouds with quiet attention. The children finish gathering stones and run toward the hillside pasture where sheep graze in scattered groups. Beyond them, the fjord shines pale blue beneath the widening morning sky. You stand there for a moment, feeling the quiet balance between land weather and human effort that defines life on this farm. Nothing here happens quickly. Every harvest begins months earlier with patient work beneath the open sky. And today is simply another step in that long and steady cycle. The farmer leaves the plough, standing near the edge of the field, while the oxen wander slowly toward a patch of grass beside the fence. The work will continue later, but for now, attention shifts to another part of the farm: animals. You follow the children along a narrow path that climbs gently toward the hillside pasture. The grass here is thicker than in the lower fields, waving softly in the steady wind that drifts down from the mountains. From a distance, you can already hear them, soft bleating from sheep, the low rumble of cattle, and the occasional impatient snort from a goat that has spotted the bucket of feed one of the children carries. Livestock forms the quiet backbone of Viking Age farms. While grain provides food for people, animals provide almost everything else needed for daily life. Milk, meat, wool, leather, bone tools, and manure for fertilizing crops all come from the creatures grazing across these hills. Excavations at Norse farm sites consistently reveal large numbers of animal bones, showing that cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were central to rural life. The exact mix varied from region to region, but sheep and cattle appear especially common across western Norway. As you enter the pasture, a group of sheep lifts their heads and watches you carefully. Their wool looks thick and uneven, far from the smooth breeds raised on modern farms. Viking sheep often carried coats that shed naturally each spring, rather than requiring shearing. One of the children walks slowly through the flock, gently guiding them toward a fresh patch of grass. The animals move together, almost like drifting clouds across the hillside. Sheep were valuable for more than just meat. Their wool supplied the fibres that families spun into thread and wove into clothing, blankets and sails. Without sheep, Viking households would struggle to produce the textiles needed for survival in cold northern climates. Nearby, a small group of goats climbs easily across a rocky slope where grass grows between stones. Goats thrive in terrain that might frustrate larger animals. They can eat a wide variety of plants and navigate steep ground without difficulty. This makes them extremely useful on rugged Norwegian farms, where not every hillside offers smooth pasture. The farmer arrives carrying a wooden bucket filled with scraps from the morning meal. The goats gather instantly. Their enthusiasm is obvious. Goats provided milk that could be turned into cheese butter and fermented dairy products that lasted longer than fresh milk. Food preservation was essential here. The seasons always moved toward winter. You notice one goat wearing a small wooden bell tied loosely around its neck. As it moves across the grass, the bell rings with a soft, hollow tone. A small but interesting observation made by archaeologists is that bells and simple animal tags have occasionally been found in Viking farm excavations. These tools likely helped farmers track livestock when animals grazed across wide mountain pastures. The sound of a bell might travel surprisingly far through a quiet valley. Farther down the slope stands a group of cattle grazing slowly near a wooden fence. Cattle were among the most valuable animals a Viking farmer could own. They provided milk, meat, hides, and sometimes served as draft animals for pulling ploughs or heavy loads. Owning several healthy cattle often signalled a household with some degree of prosperity. The farmer walks calmly among them, checking their condition with practiced eyes. He watches for signs of illness or injury, occasionally brushing flies from their backs. These animals represent security. Milk from cattle could be turned into butter and cheese that lasted through winter months. Manure from their stalls fertilised the crop fields. Their hides became leather used for shoes belts and equipment. Even the bones could be shaped into tools. Very little from an animal was wasted. You notice something curious near the edge of the pasture. A small wooden structure raised slightly above the ground. The farmer points toward it as if explaining its purpose. It is a simple shelter where milk might be stored briefly in cool shade before being carried back to the longhouse for further preparation. Dairy processing required careful timing. Milk spoils quickly unless handled properly. Historical researchers studying Norse farming methods have examined residues inside pottery vessels and wooden containers from Viking settlements. These chemical traces suggest that milk products such as butter curds and early forms of cheese were regularly produced. Fermented dairy helped families preserve nutrients in a climate where fresh food did not last long. As you walk along the fence line, one of the children kneels beside a pig, rooting happily in the soil. Pigs played a different role on Viking farms. Unlike grazing animals, pigs could forage for food in forests and near farm waste areas. They ate scraps, roots, and fallen nuts, converting otherwise useless materials into valuable meat. This made them efficient animals for households that could spare a small woodland area. One pig snorts loudly and trots past you, clearly more interested in searching for food than greeting visitors. You step aside as it pushes its nose deep into the soil. Above the pasture, a pair of ravens circle slowly, their dark wings cutting across the pale sky. Birds like these were familiar sights across Viking landscapes. Ravens especially carried symbolic meaning in Norse mythology, often associated with the god Odin. But here on the farm, they are simply part of the environment. Occasionally they steal scraps. Occasionally they warn of approaching storms. As the animals settle back into quiet grazing, the farmer leans against the fence and looks across the valley. Raising livestock in this terrain required constant attention. Animals could wander into forests, fall from rocky slopes, or fall prey to wolves during harsh winters. Because of this, many farms relied on seasonal grazing patterns. During summer months, animals were sometimes taken high into mountain pastures where grass remained fresh longer. Some historians continue examining how widespread these seasonal movements were during the Viking Age. Evidence from mountain shelters and temporary dairy structures suggests that at least some families practiced this form of summer herding. The wind moves again across the hillside, carrying the scent of grass and distant sea air. Sheep drift slowly across the pasture. Cattle chew patiently. Goats climb where they please. And you begin to see how these animals quietly sustain the entire rhythm of life on this fjordside farm. The path from the pasture slopes gently back down toward the fjord, where the water stretches out like a long ribbon between the mountains. From this distance, the surface appears almost perfectly still, broken only by faint ripples where a light breeze moves across it. The farmer walks ahead with the quiet confidence of someone who has followed this path thousands of times. One of the children carries a coil of rope, while the other holds a wooden pole used for lifting fishing nets from the water. You follow them down toward the narrow shoreline. The air grows cooler as you approach the fjord. Water has its own kind of chill, even when the sun climbs higher in the sky. Seabirds circle overhead, calling sharply as they glide across the calm surface. Near the waterline, a small wooden boat rests half-pulled onto the stones. It is much smaller than the longship that brought you here yesterday. This boat is built for everyday tasks, especially fishing close to shore. Fishing is not an occasional activity in Viking Norway. It is a regular part of life along the coast. Evidence from excavated coastal settlements shows large quantities of fish bones, hooks, and net weights, suggesting that fishing played a major role in feeding both families and local communities. The farmer steps into the boat and steadies it while the children climb aboard. You follow carefully, feeling the boat shift slightly under your weight. The wood creaks softly as it settles. Soon the boat drifts away from the stones with a quiet push of the pole. The fjord water is dark and deep. In many places along the Norwegian coast, fjords plunge hundreds of meters below the surface, carved long ago by glaciers that moved slowly through the valleys during the last ice age. Today, those deep waters provide rich fishing grounds. The farmer rows with calm, steady strokes, guiding the boat toward a line of small wooden floats bobbing gently on the surface. These floats mark the location of the fishing net placed here yesterday evening. Nets like this are made from twisted plant fibres or wool threads, carefully knotted together in patterns that allow fish to swim inside but make escape difficult. Producing a fishing net requires patience. Each knot must be tied carefully to maintain the right spacing between threads. Researchers examining preserved net fragments from Viking sites have found evidence of impressive craftsmanship. Even simple fishing tools often show careful attention to detail. The boat reaches the first float. One of the children leans forward with the wooden pole and hooks the rope attached to the net. Slowly together, you begin pulling the wet net up from the water. It rises heavily dripping cold fjord water across the side of the boat. Then you see the first flash of silver. Fish. Several cod twist and flick within the net, their scales reflecting sunlight as they struggle briefly before growing still. The farmer smiles slightly. This is a good catch. Cod is one of the most important fish along the Norwegian coast. Its firm flesh dries well and can be preserved for long periods, making it a reliable source of food throughout the year. Some historians studying medieval trade believe dried cod eventually became one of Norway's most important export goods during later centuries. For now, though, it is simply dinner. The children carefully remove the fish from the net, while the farmer checks for damage to the rope and knots. Nets can tear easily if fish struggle too violently, or if the net catches on rocks beneath the water. Maintaining fishing equipment is constant work. Once the fish are secured in a wooden crate, the farmer gestures toward the open fjord beyond. From here, the water stretches outward toward distant islands that appear as faint shadows against the horizon. Boats from farms like this often travel along the coastline to trade fish, grain wool, and other goods with neighbouring communities. The sea connects people far more easily than the rugged mountain paths inland. Archaeological finds along the Norwegian coast reveal many small landing areas and boat sheds where vessels could be protected from storms. These simple harbours allowed even small communities to participate in regional trade networks. You notice something interesting attached to the inside of the boat. A collection of bone fishing hooks tied neatly along a leather cord. While iron hooks existed, bone hooks were also commonly used. They could be carved from animal bones using simple tools and replaced easily when damaged. One intriguing discovery from Viking-era excavations is that some fishing hooks show slight variations in shape, depending on the type of fish being targeted. This suggests that fishermen understood the behaviour of different species and adjusted their equipment accordingly. Fishing knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. The farmer dips his hand into the fjord water and lets it run across his fingers. Cold. Even in summer, these waters remain chilled by northern currents and deep underwater layers. Experts studying climate conditions of the early medieval North Atlantic continue discussing how ocean temperatures may have influenced fish populations during the Viking Age. Some evidence suggests certain fish species may have been even more abundant during this period. Whatever the reason, the fjords clearly offered reliable fishing. The boat begins drifting slowly while the farmer prepares another line. Instead of a net this time, he attaches several baited hooks to a long cord and lowers them carefully into the water. This technique allows fish to bite one hook at a time. You sit quietly, while the line sinks beneath the surface. The fjord around you is peaceful. Mountains rise steeply on both sides, their slopes covered with dark green forest. Above them, the sky stretches wide and pale blue. It's easy to forget that the same waters supporting this calm morning fishing trip also carried Viking ships across the North Sea toward distant lands. But here today, the fjord is simply a provider of food. A gentle tug pulls at the fishing line. The farmer lifts it slowly. Another cod appears. More silver flashes in the sunlight. And the quiet harvest from the sea continues. The small boat glides back toward the rocky shoreline with a soft scraping sound as its hull touches the stones. The crate of fish rests between your feet, still damp from the cold fjord water. Sunlight now spreads fully across the valley, warming the grass and sending thin threads of mist drifting away from the surface of the sea. You step carefully out of the boat while the farmer pulls it farther onto the shore. The children lift the crate together, proud of their contribution to the morning's work. Fishing may look peaceful from the outside, but it requires skill, patience, and knowledge of the fjord, knowing where fish gather when tides shift, and how weather affects movement beneath the water, often determines whether a day brings food or disappointment. You begin walking back toward the longhouse along the narrow path. The crate of cod feels heavier with every step, but the smell of fresh fish reminds you that the effort will soon turn into a warm meal. As the buildings of the farm appear again ahead of you, the longhouse roof stands out against the hillside, its thick layer of grass glowing green beneath the rising sun. The woman of the household waits outside near a wooden table that has been placed beside the doorway. This table will soon become a small workspace for preparing the fish. You set the crate down. Without wasting time, she reaches for a knife with a blade slightly longer than the small utility knives you noticed earlier. Fish preparation is clearly something she has done countless times. Clean movements, confident hands. Within moments, the first cod is laid across the wooden board. Fish were an everyday food for coastal Viking communities, and methods for preserving them developed over centuries. Drying fish in the open air allowed families to store large quantities for winter months, when fresh catches became more difficult. You watch as the fish is cleaned and split along its length. The bones are removed with swift precision. Soon, rows of cleaned fish begin forming across a wooden rack placed in the sunlight. Wind from the fjord will help dry them slowly over the coming days. Excavations in coastal Norway have uncovered numerous drying racks and processing areas near Viking settlements. These findings suggest that fish preservation was not simply household work, but sometimes part of larger production efforts in certain regions. The children rinse their hands in a bucket of water and begin carrying smaller fish toward another rack nearby. Work spreads naturally across the farm. While this happens, the farmer walks toward a shed beside the longhouse, where several large wooden barrels stand against the wall. Inside these barrels are layers of coarse salt traded from distant regions. Salt was extremely valuable in the Viking world because it allowed food to be preserved much longer than simple drying alone. Trade networks across northern Europe moved salt from coastal evaporation sites and inland salt springs toward communities that needed it for food storage. One intriguing detail uncovered by historians is that some Viking trading voyages carried large quantities of preserved fish southward in exchange for salt metals and luxury goods. This created a cycle where fish helped secure the very salt needed to preserve more fish. As the farmer sprinkles a light layer of salt across part of the catch, you begin to see how carefully food preparation is organised here. Nothing happens randomly. Every piece of fish must either be eaten quickly dried or salted, depending on how long the household hopes to store it. You glance toward the longhouse doorway, where the cooking pot from earlier still hangs above the hearth. Steam rises gently from the simmering broth inside. The smell drifting from the pot now carries a richer scent of herbs and vegetables. Soon, some of the fresh fish will join that stew. A small but fascinating observation made by archaeologists studying Viking kitchens is that cooking tools remained surprisingly simple. Iron pots, wooden bowls, clay vessels and knives formed the basic equipment for preparing most meals. Despite this simplicity, Viking households created a wide variety of dishes using grains, dairy, fish, meat and gathered plants. Across the yard, the dog circles the racks of drying fish with great interest, but keeps a respectful distance after a brief warning from the woman. Clearly the dog has learned this lesson before. You notice the farmer pausing near the fence to look toward the distant water again. Beyond the fjord entrance lies the open sea. From there, ships could travel toward Denmark, the British Isles, or even farther into the Atlantic. Life here may seem quiet today, but the same coastal waters connecting farms also carried the famous Viking voyages that shaped early medieval history. Researchers continue discussing exactly how many coastal farmers participated in those journeys. Some believe most raiding crews were drawn from farming communities like this one during certain seasons, while others suggest specialized warrior groups may have organized many expeditions. The evidence leaves room for interpretation. For now, however, the only voyage taking place today involved a small fishing boat and a short trip along the fjord. The work of the morning gradually slows as the fish are arranged neatly across the racks. Sunlight and wind will now take over the task of preservation. You wash your hands in cool water from the bucket and glance once more across the valley. The fields ripple with barley. Sheep graze along the hillside. Smoke drifts gently from the longhouse roof. The simple tasks of farming, fishing, and preparing food form the quiet structure of life here. And as the smell of stew grows stronger inside the longhouse, you realise the next part of the day is already beginning. The warmth inside the longhouse feels especially welcome after the cool wind from the fjord. When you step through the doorway again, the smell of simmering stew and wood smoke greets you like an old companion. The pot hanging above the fire bubbles gently now, sending small bursts of steam toward the smoke hole in the roof. The children follow you inside their boots, leaving faint marks across the packed earth floor before they settle near the hearth. Outside work may pause for a while, but learning never really stops in a Viking household. Children here grow into their roles slowly but steadily. You notice the boy from earlier sitting beside the farmer with a small wooden knife in his hands. The blade is dull and clearly meant for practice, rather than serious work. The farmer holds a thin piece of wood and demonstrates how to shave small curls from the surface. Patient movements, careful attention, learning by watching. Material uncovered from Norse settlements suggests that children began learning practical skills very early. Carved toys, miniature tools and small training objects have been found during excavations, indicating that childhood often involved imitation of adult work. The boy copies the motion, shaving a crooked sliver from the stick. The farmer nods with quiet approval. Nearby, the girl sits beside the woman who earlier spun wool near the doorway. Now a small spindle hangs between the woman's fingers while she slowly twists fibres into thread. The girl watches closely, occasionally trying to copy the movement with her own shorter strand of wool. Spinning thread appears simple when done by experienced hands, but it takes practice to keep the thread even and strong. Archaeological finds from Viking settlements frequently include spindle whorls, small weighted discs used during spinning. These objects appear in large numbers across Scandinavia, suggesting that textile work was constant within many homes. Clothing sales, ropes and blankets all required thread, and thread required patience. You sit quietly on the bench while watching these small lessons unfold. Childhood here looks different from what many people imagine today. There are no classrooms, no written textbooks, and very few moments dedicated purely to play. Yet children do laugh. They whisper to each other. They invent small games with wooden animals and carved boats. They chase the dog outside when a work pauses. Life still contains joy. One surprising detail from archaeological discoveries is that many Viking toys appear remarkably creative. Small wooden swords, animal figurines, spinning tops, and board game pieces have been found in settlement layers. These objects show that imagination flourished even in demanding environments. The boy finishes carving the stick and holds it up proudly. It resembles a tiny spear. The farmer chuckles softly before adjusting the boy's grip and showing him how to smooth the rough edges. Skill builds slowly. Across the fire, the girl finally manages to spin a short length of thread without breaking it. Her face lights up with quiet excitement as the woman nods approvingly. Outside, the wind brushes softly against the turf roof. The valley remains calm. You realise that learning in this world depends almost entirely on observation and repetition. Children watch adults work every day. Over time, they absorb the knowledge needed to manage farms, craft tools, cook meals, and travel across land and sea. Stories also play an important role. Later tonight, perhaps after dinner, someone in the longhouse may tell a story from memory. These stories carry lessons about courage, loyalty, cleverness, and sometimes mistakes that others should avoid. Many Norse sagas recorded centuries later likely began as oral tales passed down through gatherings exactly like this. One curious discovery from Viking sites involves small gaming boards carved into pieces of wood or stone. Some of these boards appear designed for a strategy game called Hnefatafl. The game involved two sides, one defending a king piece, while the other attempted to capture it. Children and adults both played. Games like this taught patience, planning, and strategy. Skills useful not only in play, but also in life. As the lesson continues, the stew in the pot thickens slightly. The woman lifts the lid and stirs slowly, adding several pieces of fresh fish from the morning catch. The scent fills the longhouse with comforting warmth. The boy glances toward the pot and smiles. Learning may be important, but lunch is even more appealing. Outside, a raven lands briefly on the roof beam near the doorway before flapping away again toward the fjord. Birds often linger around farms hoping for scraps. Meanwhile, the farmer places the small practice knife back into a wooden chest and begins checking a set of leather straps hanging near the wall. Tools must be maintained regularly. If a strap breaks during fieldwork or animal handling, problems can escalate quickly. Children watch even this small act of preparation. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is ignored. Experts studying early medieval family life still discuss how structured childhood might have been in Viking society. Some evidence suggests children gained increasing responsibilities as they grew older, eventually contributing fully to farm labour by their early teenage years. But for now, these children still live in the gentle space between learning and work. The fire crackles softly as another log settles into the embers. Steam rises from the pot again. The valley outside remains peaceful. And inside the longhouse, knowledge continues passing quietly from one generation to the next. The stew is nearly ready now. You can hear the soft bubbling of broth each time the lid of the iron pot shifts slightly above the fire. The smell of fish, herbs, and barley drifts across the longhouse and settles into the air like a warm invitation. Yet before the meal begins, the farmer stands and moves toward a workbench near the far wall. This corner of the longhouse is filled with tools. Some hang neatly from wooden pegs. Others rest in small chests or baskets lined with cloth. You walk closer and begin to see how much of Viking life depends on craftwork done inside homes like this one. The farmer picks up a short-handled hammer and an iron chisel. On the table sits a piece of wood that looks partly shaped already. He begins carving slowly. Tap. Pause. Another careful strike. The sound echoes softly against the timber walls. Woodworking was one of the most important everyday skills in Viking society. Timber was everywhere in Norway. Forests provided the raw material for houses, boats, tools, furniture, and countless other objects used across daily life. Archaeological finds from Viking settlements reveal large collections of woodworking tools, including axes, adzes, chisels and knives designed for shaping wood into precise forms. Many of these tools show signs of long use, their handles worn smooth by years of work. The farmer turns the piece of wood in his hands and begins smoothing its surface with a knife. Gradually, the shape becomes clearer. A wooden bowl. Bowls like this were essential items in Viking households. They held porridge, stew milk, and berries gathered from nearby forests. Unlike clay vessels, wooden bowls were lighter and less likely to break if dropped. You watch thin curls of wood fall onto the table as the farmer continues carving. Nearby, the woman finishes spinning another length of thread and sets the spindle aside. Now she moves toward a small upright loom placed near the wall. The loom looks simple but sturdy. Vertical threads stretch tightly between wooden beams, forming the base structure for weaving cloth. Textile production required enormous effort. Spinning thread was only the first step. Once enough thread existed, it had to be woven carefully into fabric, strong enough for clothing blankets and sails. Excavations across Scandinavia frequently uncover loom weights made from clay or stone. These weights kept vertical threads tight during weaving. Their presence at many farm sites suggests that weaving was a common activity within households. The woman begins guiding a shuttle carrying thread back and forth through the vertical strands. Slow rhythm, quiet concentration. Each pass of the thread slowly builds the cloth. One small but fascinating detail discovered by textile researchers is that Viking fabrics sometimes used complex weaving patterns that produced subtle designs within the cloth itself. Even everyday garments could carry quiet artistry hidden in their structure. Meanwhile, the children sit near the bench, watching both tasks unfold. The boy reaches for a scrap piece of wood and begins copying the carving motion he learned earlier. The girl experiments with twisting small strands of wool into thread. Learning happens through imitation. Across the room, you notice another interesting tool resting near the doorway, a small iron anvil. Beside it lies a pair of tongs and a hammer. Metalworking often took place in small outdoor forges, but some basic repair work could be done inside or near the longhouse. Iron tools were incredibly valuable during the Viking Age. Producing iron required smelting ore in specialised furnaces, a process that demanded skill and access to raw materials. Because iron was precious, tools were repaired repeatedly rather than discarded. A curious detail uncovered by archaeologists is that many Viking tools show clear signs of reshaping and reuse. Broken blades were shortened, edges were sharpened again and again, and damaged metal was repurposed whenever possible. Nothing useful was wasted. The farmer finishes shaping the bowl and begins smoothing its surface with sand and a piece of rough cloth. The interior becomes gradually smoother under his careful hands. Soon it will join the other bowls stacked neatly on a nearby shelf. Outside, the wind brushes gently across the hillside, carrying the distant sound of sheep bells from the pasture. You realise that craftwork fills the quieter moments between larger farm tasks. When weather prevents fieldwork or darkness arrives early. During winter months, activities like carving, spinning and weaving become essential. They transform spare time into necessary preparation. The woman pauses briefly from the loom and checks the stew pot again. This time she nods. Lunch is ready. Bowls are placed along the table one by one. The farmer lifts the pot carefully, using a thick cloth to protect his hands from the heat. The stew pours slowly into each bowl. Pieces of fish float beside barley grains, and chopped herbs forming a meal both simple and satisfying. You sit down with the others and hold the wooden bowl in your hands. Warmth spreads through your fingers. Across from you, the farmer sets down the newly carved bowl and smiles slightly pleased with his morning's work. Outside, the fjord remains calm beneath the midday sun. Inside the longhouse, the quiet skills of Viking life continue shaping the tools, clothing and objects that keep the household running day after day. After the meal, the longhouse grows briefly quiet again. Bowls are rinsed with water from a wooden bucket, and the last pieces of barley bread are wrapped in cloth for later. Outside, the sun has climbed high enough that the valley feels softer and warmer than it did earlier in the morning. The farmer stands near the doorway and looks toward the fjord. It is time to travel. Not far, just along the water. But in Viking Norway, even short journeys often happen by boat rather than on land. The mountains surrounding the valley rise steeply, and the forest paths between farms twist across uneven ground. The fjord, by contrast, offers a long, smooth road made of water. You walk down to the shoreline once more, where the small boat rests where it was pulled earlier. The morning's fishing gear has been stacked neatly inside, but today the boat carries something different. A bundle of wool, 2 small sacks of barley grain, and a few dried fish tied together with rope. These goods will be delivered to a neighbouring farm farther down the fjord. Perhaps the family there will trade butter or cheese in return. Perhaps news will be exchanged instead of goods. Movement between farms was an important part of Viking life. Excavations along Norwegian coastlines show that many settlements sat within short sailing distance of one another. Boats allowed people to maintain contact, exchange resources, and strengthen alliances across scattered communities. The farmer pushes the boat gently into the water while you and the children climb inside. Soon the boat glides away from the shore again. The oars dip into the fjord with slow, steady strokes. Water moves quietly around the hull as you travel along the narrow inlet. Above you, the mountains rise in layered slopes of forest and rock. Small waterfalls glimmer in the sunlight where streams tumble down from higher ground. From the water, you begin to notice other farms. Some appear as small clearings with turf-roofed buildings near the shoreline. Others sit higher on slopes where fields catch more sunlight. Smoke drifts upward from several longhouses. Each farm is its own small world, but the fjord connects them all. Material uncovered from coastal farm sites suggests that boats of many sizes were common in Viking communities. Larger longships handled long voyages across the sea, but smaller rowboats like this one carried people, animals and supplies along local waterways. For many families, the boat was as essential as the house itself. You glide past a rocky outcrop where seabirds gather in noisy clusters. One child points toward them and laughs as the birds scatter briefly into the air. Then the boat rounds a bend in the fjord. Ahead, another farm appears on a narrow strip of land between forest and water. Its buildings look similar to the ones you left earlier today. A longhouse stands at the centre, surrounded by smaller sheds and fenced pastures. Sheep move slowly across the hillside above the buildings. As the boat approaches, someone on the shore raises a hand in greeting. Visitors are never entirely unexpected in places like this. The fjord constantly carries people back and forth. You guide the boat toward a small wooden landing where flat stones form a simple dock. The farmer ties the rope to a post, while the children lift the bundles of goods from the boat. Soon you are walking toward the farm. The air smells slightly different here, more pine perhaps, and the faint scent of drying fish from racks placed near the water. The farmer speaks with the man who greeted you earlier. Their conversation seems relaxed but attentive. Trade does not always require formal agreements. Often it happens through quiet understanding built over years of cooperation between neighbouring farms. One curious detail noticed by researchers studying Norse trade patterns is that even small communities sometimes possessed goods from very distant regions. Glass beads from the Middle East, silver coins from the Islamic world, and silk fragments from Asia have appeared in Scandinavian burial sites. These discoveries reveal how connected Viking trade networks eventually became. Of course, farms like this one usually exchanged far more ordinary items: food, wool, tools, news. While the adults speak, the children wander toward a wooden rack where several carved game pieces rest on a small board. The board resembles the strategy game you saw earlier inside the longhouse. Games like these appear to have been popular across Viking communities. Stone boards and carved pieces have been discovered in several Norse settlements. The pieces on this board are shaped like small cones and flat discs. One of the children moves a piece cautiously while the others watch. Nearby, the adults finish their exchange. A small bundle of cheese changes hands. So does a jar of preserved berries gathered from forest plants. The farmer adds these items to the boat's cargo. Trade completed. Before leaving, the two farmers stand for a moment looking out across the fjord. Perhaps they discuss weather. Perhaps the condition of crops. Perhaps rumours of ships seen farther along the coast. Researchers studying early Scandinavian communities continue examining how often information travelled between farms like these. Some evidence suggests that news about trade opportunities or potential danger could spread surprisingly quickly along coastal networks. Word moved with the boats. Soon the bundles are secured again and everyone returns to the shoreline. The boat pushes away from the landing and begins the quiet journey back through the fjord. Sunlight now reflects brightly off the water. The mountains stand silent above. And once again, the small boat carries you along the natural highways that connect the scattered farms of Viking Norway. The boat glides quietly across the fjord as you begin the journey back toward the familiar farm. The water is smoother now than it was earlier, reflecting the sky so clearly that the mountains seem to float upside down beneath the surface. The farmer rows slowly, allowing the boat to drift between strokes. Travel along the fjord rarely feels rushed. Distance here is measured by patience rather than speed. As the shoreline curves around another rocky bend, you begin to notice something interesting. A larger vessel rests near a small cove farther ahead. Even from a distance, it looks different from the small working boats used by the farms. Its hull is longer and sits deeper in the water. A mast rises from the centre, though the sail is currently folded and tied. It is a trading ship. The farmer pauses rowing for a moment to study it. Trade ships visited many coastal communities during the Viking Age, carrying goods between distant regions. Some voyages stretched across the North Sea to Britain, while others followed river routes deep into Eastern Europe. Material recovered from Viking trading centres such as Birka and Hedeby shows that Scandinavian merchants participated in wide trade networks linking northern Europe with lands far beyond. You guide the small boat toward the cove, curiosity drawing you closer. As you approach, the size of the vessel becomes more impressive. Its wooden planks curve smoothly along the sides, overlapping each other in the traditional clinker style that Viking shipbuilders perfected. This construction method allowed ships to remain strong while still flexible enough to handle rough ocean waves. The larger vessel rests quietly in the sheltered water while several people move about its deck. One man lifts a crate while another checks ropes tied along the mast. Trade voyages required careful preparation. Cargo had to be balanced correctly so the ship would remain stable during long journeys across open sea. You notice a collection of wooden barrels stacked near the stern. Inside them may be dried fish grain furs or other goods collected from farms along the coast. A number of discoveries from Viking trading sites reveal that furs from northern forests were especially valuable items in international trade. Pelts from animals such as fox marten and squirrel travel great distances and were exchanged for silver textiles and other luxury goods. The farmer calls out a greeting as your boat drifts closer. One of the traders steps toward the edge of the ship and waves in return. Their conversation carries easily across the still water. It seems this vessel arrived earlier in the morning and plans to continue south along the coast once supplies are gathered. Trade ships often moved from settlement to settlement, collecting goods before setting out on longer routes. You climb briefly onto the deck while the farmer secures the smaller boat alongside. Standing here gives you a clearer view of the ship's structure. The deck is narrow but organised carefully. Cargo sits tightly packed along the centre, while space remains open near the sides for rowers when wind conditions require oars. The mast tower above you supports a large square sail currently bundled neatly with rope. One intriguing detail discovered by maritime archaeologists is that Viking sails were often made from wool cloth treated with animal fats to improve water resistance. Producing enough cloth for a sail required enormous effort. Some estimates suggest that a single large sail could require wool from hundreds of sheep. That realization makes the sail above you feel even more impressive. The trader shows the farmer several small items recently acquired during earlier stops along the coast. Among them are bright glass beads. They shine with deep colours of blue and green when held in the sunlight. Beads like these appear frequently in Viking graves, especially in women's jewellery collections. Many were imported from regions far beyond Scandinavia. Glass bead production centres existed in areas stretching from the Mediterranean to the Middle East. Their presence here reveals how wide Viking trade connections eventually reached. The trader also reveals a small silver coin stamped with unfamiliar markings. Coins like this often travelled long distances through trade routes linking northern Europe with Islamic regions to the east. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of these coins in Scandinavian hoards, suggesting that silver served as an important form of wealth during the Viking Age. However, the farmer examines the coin politely and shakes his head. For today, the fish grain and wool from nearby farms remain the main focus of exchange. Trade in this quiet fjord still revolves around practical goods. While you stand on the deck, the wind picks up slightly and the bundled sail rustles softly above. You glance out across the fjord and imagine what it must feel like when this vessel sets out into the open sea. Long journeys across unpredictable waters required courage and skill. Researchers studying Viking navigation still discuss exactly how sailors guided their ships across such distances. Some believe sunstones may have helped detect the position of the sun through clouds, while others think experienced sailors relied primarily on coastal landmarks and knowledge of ocean currents. The truth may involve a combination of both. For now, the ship remains anchored peacefully in the sheltered cove. The farmer thanks the traders for the news they share about distant settlements along the coast. Then you climb back into the smaller boat. Soon the oars dip once again into the water and the quiet rhythm of rowing resumes. Behind you, the trading ship remains in the cove, waiting for the right wind to carry it onward through the vast network of Viking trade routes. Ahead, the familiar shoreline of the farm begins to appear once more between the trees. The small boat glides back into the familiar curve of the shoreline, and soon the farm appears once again between the slopes of grass and pine. From the water, the longhouse looks steady and calm, its turf roof blending so naturally into the hillside that it almost disappears against the green. The farmer guides the boat toward the same patch of smooth stones where you landed earlier in the day. The hull touches the shore with a soft scrape. Together you pull the boat higher onto land, so the tide will not carry it away. The fjord behind you stretches quiet and wide, but the rhythm of farm life pulls your attention back toward the valley. As you walk up the path toward the longhouse, the farmer slows his steps and points toward the far end of the settlement. Several people are gathered there. A small group stands near a cleared area beside the building speaking in low voices. From the way they stand close together, you sense that something important is taking place. Today is not just another ordinary day of farm work. It is a day for the thing. You follow the farmer toward the gathering place. The grass here has been worn down by many footsteps over the years. A few large stones sit around the clearing, forming natural seats for those who attend. The thing was an assembly where people met to discuss disputes, make agreements, and settle questions of law. Evidence from early Scandinavian legal traditions shows that these assemblies were central to Viking society. Rather than relying on a single ruler to judge every matter, communities gathered regularly to resolve conflicts together. Men from nearby farms stand in small clusters while they speak quietly. Some lean on walking sticks. Others rest hands on the hilts of their knives, though not in any threatening way. The knives are tools carried every day, not symbols of conflict. The farmer greets several people with nods and brief words. You notice that most conversations remain calm and respectful. Maintaining peace between neighbours is extremely important in places where families depend on each other for support. At the centre of the clearing stands an older man with grey hair tied back loosely. His posture is relaxed but confident, and people naturally turn their attention toward him. This man serves as the law speaker. In Viking communities, law speakers held the responsibility of remembering and reciting legal traditions during gatherings. Written laws were rare at this time, so knowledge of legal rules had to be preserved through memory and careful repetition. Historical sources suggest that law speakers memorized large portions of legal codes and recited them aloud during assemblies. This role required both intelligence and respect within the community. You sit quietly on one of the stones while the discussion begins. Two farmers step forward. Their disagreement seems to involve grazing land near a mountain pasture used during summer months. One claims his sheep were chased away from an area his family has used for years. The other insists the land belongs to his household. The law speaker listens patiently as each man explains his position. He does not interrupt. When both sides finish, several other farmers speak. They offer observations about the pasture, recalling how the land has been used during previous seasons. Memory becomes evidence. Witnesses matter more than written records here. A remarkable feature of Viking legal culture is how much emphasis it placed on public participation. Decisions often emerged through discussion among community members rather than through strict orders imposed by a distant authority. Eventually the law speaker raises a hand to quiet the group. He begins describing the traditional boundaries of the pasture according to older agreements remembered by several families. His words move slowly and clearly so everyone can hear. The dispute gradually softens. The two farmers exchange looks before nodding in reluctant agreement with the solution offered. The pasture will be shared during different parts of the season. Conflict resolved. You realise how important gatherings like this are for maintaining stability. Without a system for settling disputes, small disagreements could easily grow into dangerous feuds between families. Some historians studying Viking legal systems note that assemblies like the Thing help prevent violence by providing structured ways to resolve tensions. Even so, the system relied heavily on cooperation. Not every dispute ended peacefully. One curious detail recorded in later Icelandic sagas describes how law speakers sometimes stood on special rocks during assemblies so their voices would carry farther across the crowd. The stones surrounding this clearing might serve a similar purpose. The meeting continues as other matters are discussed. One farmer reports damage to a fence line caused by wandering cattle. Another asks for help repairing a shared pathway that leads into the forest. These discussions may seem small, but they shape daily life in the valley. After some time, the gathering begins to break apart. People stretch their legs, shake hands, and exchange quiet words before returning toward their homes and fields. The farmer beside you stands and brushes grass from his cloak. The sun now leans slightly westward above the mountains, reminding everyone that the afternoon still holds work to finish. As you walk back toward the longhouse, you look once more across the clearing where the assembly took place. Simple stones, worn grass. Yet within this quiet space, the laws and agreements that hold the community together continue to live. The gathering at the clearing slowly fades as people return to their farms. Voices grow distant behind you while the farmer leads the way back along the narrow path toward the longhouse. The grass bends gently beneath your boots, still warm from the afternoon sun. Moments like the one you just witnessed leave a quiet impression. In a place where families live scattered across valleys and fjords, reputation matters deeply. A person's name travels almost as easily as boats do along the coast. The farmer walks beside you with relaxed steps, but you notice how people greeted him during the meeting earlier. Nods of recognition, friendly remarks, no tension in their voices. That is not accidental. In Viking society, honour shapes many everyday decisions. Archaeological evidence and surviving Norse texts both suggest that personal reputation held enormous importance within Scandinavian communities. A person's word, loyalty and fairness often determined how others treated them during trade disputes or alliances. Without strong centralised governments controlling daily life, trust between individuals became the foundation of social stability. You reach the farmyard where sheep wander lazily near the fence. The dog greets you again with a wagging tail before settling into the shade beside the doorway. The farmer pauses to adjust the latch on the gate before speaking briefly with the woman of the house. Their conversation is calm and practical. They discuss the outcome of the meeting and the shared use of the mountain pasture. Disputes like the one you saw today rarely exist in isolation. Land boundaries, grazing rights and access to water all influence the balance between neighbouring farms. Because farmland is limited in these narrow valleys, communities must cooperate carefully. Inside the longhouse, the afternoon light streams through the doorway, illuminating dust drifting slowly through the smoky air. You sit again near the central hearth while the farmer hangs his cloak on a wooden peg. Honour here is not simply about bravery in battle. It also grows through smaller actions, keeping promises, helping neighbours, maintaining fairness during trade. These quiet behaviours build a reputation that protects families over generations. One interesting aspect of Norse culture appears in the idea of reputation lasting beyond a person's lifetime. Stories about honourable or dishonourable actions could remain part of family memory long after someone had passed away. This meant that individual behaviour shaped how future generations would be viewed. In a society where written records were rare, memory carried great power. The children enter the longhouse soon after you. They speak excitedly about the gathering, clearly fascinated by the adults discussing land boundaries and decisions. Even at their young age, they understand that meetings like the one earlier help maintain peace in the valley. You notice the boy practicing the carving motion again with his small wooden knife. Perhaps one day he will attend the thing not just as a listener, but as a speaker representing his household. Across the room, the woman lifts a clay jug and pours a small amount of ale into wooden cups. The drink is light and slightly sour, meant more for refreshment than celebration. She offers one to the farmer and another to you. You take a slow sip while watching the quiet activity inside the hall. Life here moves steadily forward. Beyond the doorway, the fjord remains calm, shining beneath the afternoon sun. Reputation also influences relationships between families during trade and travel. When ships arrive carrying merchants from distant regions, local farmers prefer dealing with individuals known for honesty and reliability. Trade partnerships often grow over years of repeated contact. Historians studying Viking commerce sometimes emphasize how trust networks allowed goods to move across enormous distances without modern legal contracts. Silver coins, furs, and glass beads travel through chains of agreements built largely on personal credibility. Of course, not every interaction ended peacefully. Feuds between families did occur, sometimes lasting many years. The surviving Icelandic sagas describe dramatic examples of long-running conflicts fueled by insult or broken agreements. While these stories were written later, they likely reflect real tensions that occasionally emerged in Norse communities. Still, the assembly you witnessed earlier shows how much effort people invested in avoiding those outcomes. Community discussions offered a path toward resolution before anger grew too strong. The farmer steps outside briefly and returns with a bundle of split firewood. He places several pieces onto the embers, and the flames rise again with a soft crackling sound. Warm light spreads across the wooden walls. You notice the carved bowl he completed earlier resting beside the others on the shelf. A small object, but it carries the mark of his skill. Reputation builds slowly like that bowl, shaped over time through careful work and steady hands. Outside, a breeze moves down from the mountains and rustles the grass along the hillside. Sheep bells ring faintly in the distance. The valley feels peaceful again. The meeting has ended. The decisions have been accepted, and the quiet rhythm of farm life continues under the wide northern sky. The afternoon light slowly softens as the sun begins drifting lower toward the mountains. Shadows stretch across the valley, turning the grass fields into long ribbons of gold and green. Work on the farm continues for a while longer, but something in the air has begun to shift. Tonight there will be a feast. Not a grand royal celebration, like the ones described in heroic stories, but a gathering that still carries warmth and importance. A few neighbours from nearby farms will visit. Food prepared earlier in the day will be shared. Stories will move around the room as easily as cups of ale. Inside the longhouse, preparations quietly begin. The woman lifts several larger wooden bowls from the shelf and sets them along the long table near the hearth. The children carry extra benches closer to the fire so visitors will have a place to sit. The farmer steps outside and returns with a bundle of dried wood to keep the fire burning steadily throughout the evening. The smell of cooking soon fills the hall again. Earlier you watched fish being cleaned and placed on drying racks. Now several fresh pieces are added to a large pot along with barley herbs and a small portion of salted meat saved for occasions like this. Food in Viking communities often centred around communal sharing. Meals were rarely eaten alone when visitors were present. Archaeological remains from Norse halls suggest that communal eating played an important role in strengthening social ties between families. Long tables and shared bowls appear frequently in reconstructions of Viking domestic spaces. You sit near the hearth while the fire grows brighter. The longhouse feels larger when people begin to gather. Soon, footsteps approach outside. The dog lifts its head, listening carefully before wagging its tail in recognition. Two visitors step through the doorway. They remove their cloaks and greet the farmer with firm handshakes. Their clothing carries the smell of wind and forest from the walk along the valley path. One of them brings a small basket filled with wild berries gathered from nearby woodland slopes. The other carries a round of fresh cheese wrapped in cloth. Gifts like these are common during shared meals. Exchange strengthens friendship. You notice how naturally everyone moves inside the hall. Guests sit comfortably along the benches, while the woman ladles steaming stew into wooden bowls. The fire crackles warmly between them. Cups of ale are filled from a clay jug and passed along the table. A detail often highlighted by researchers studying Viking gatherings is the importance of hospitality. Offering food, drink and shelter to guests was considered both a social duty and a way to build alliances. A host who treated visitors generously enhanced their household's reputation. The bowls are soon placed before everyone. You lift your spoon and taste the stew. It is richer than the earlier meal, flavoured with herbs, and a hint of salted meat that adds depth to the broth. Conversation flows easily around the table. The visitors speak about conditions on their farms. One mentions that wolves were heard near the forest edge last week. Another describes a boat seen far out in the fjord carrying traders heading south. News travels quickly when people gather like this. Even small details matter. One visitor removes a small object from his pouch and places it on the table. It is a bead made from polished amber. The warm golden colour catches the firelight beautifully. Amber jewellery appears frequently in Viking-era graves and settlements. Pieces of amber were often collected from coastal regions along the Baltic Sea and traded widely throughout northern Europe. The bead passes slowly from hand to hand as people admire it. One of the children stares at it with wide eyes. Objects like this remind everyone that the world beyond the valley stretches far across land and sea. As the meal continues, laughter grows louder. Stories begin to emerge. One visitor describes a storm that nearly overturned his boat during a fishing trip earlier in the year. Another tells a tale about a stubborn goat that climbed onto a neighbour's roof and refused to come down for hours. Not every story involves heroism. Many simply celebrate the strange little moments of daily life. A curious detail preserved in several Norse accounts is that feasts sometimes included playful contests of storytelling or memory. Guests might challenge one another to recall long family histories or recount past adventures. Such traditions helped keep oral history alive within the community. Tonight, the gathering remains relaxed and friendly. The fire burns steadily as darkness settles outside. Through the open doorway, you can see the first stars appearing above the fjord. The mountains fade into dark shapes against the sky. Inside the longhouse, warmth and conversation continue. The dog curls beneath the table. The children lean closer to the storytellers, and for a few peaceful hours the farm becomes not just a place of work, but a place of shared laughter beneath the glowing firelight. The fire burns brighter as night settles fully over the valley. Outside, the fjord reflects a sky scattered with quiet stars, while the mountains stand dark and still against the horizon. Inside the longhouse, the warmth of the hearth gathers everyone close together. The bowls of stew are mostly empty now, though a few scraps of barley and herbs still cling to the sides. The wooden cups continue to pass from hand to hand as the conversation deepens and slows into something more thoughtful. This is the moment when stories begin to take centre stage. One of the visitors leans back slightly and clears his throat, drawing the attention of the room. The children lean forward immediately, sensing that something interesting is about to unfold. Storytelling carried enormous importance in Norse culture. Long before written histories became common in Scandinavia, stories served as the main way to preserve memory. Tales of ancestors' voyages, feuds and heroic deeds were passed from generation to generation through spoken word. The visitor begins slowly. His voice rises and falls in a rhythm that feels almost musical. He describes a distant relative who sailed west many years ago and returned with strange stories about unfamiliar lands across the ocean. The children listen with wide eyes. Adults smile quietly, already familiar with parts of the tale. Research into Norse oral traditions suggests that skilled storytellers known as skalds played an important role in Viking society. These poets crafted verses celebrating important leaders, battles and journeys. Their performances often combined history with poetic expression, creating narratives that could be remembered and repeated for many years. The visitor's story does not follow strict poetry, but the spirit remains similar. He describes waves rising like mountains during the voyage. He speaks of strange birds circling above distant shores. At one point he pauses and laughs, admitting that his relative may have exaggerated parts of the tale. Stories often grow slightly larger each time they are told. Across the fire, the farmer nods thoughtfully. He adds a short memory of his own, describing how his father once sailed north during a fishing expedition and returned with tales of icy waters filled with massive whales. The conversation moves naturally from one voice to another. One person remembers a storm. Another recalls a difficult winter when snow covered the valley for weeks. Memory becomes shared history. A curious detail uncovered in Norse literary traditions is that some skaldic poems were constructed with extremely complex patterns of rhythm and metaphor. These structures help performers memorize long passages without written notes. Such poetic skill earned great respect within Viking communities. You notice the girl from earlier quietly whispering parts of the story to herself, as if practicing the words. Children often learned these stories simply by hearing them repeated during gatherings like this. Outside, the wind brushes lightly across the roof, sending a faint rustle through the grass growing above the longhouse. The fire crackles as another log settles into the embers. Someone refills the cups again. The visitor who began the earlier story now shifts into another tale. This one speaks of the god Thor travelling across the sky with thunder rolling behind his chariot. The children exchange excited looks. Myths and everyday stories blend easily in Norse storytelling. Gods appear beside farmers. Giants lurk beyond mountains. Magical creatures hide in forests not far from human settlements. The boundary between legend and life often feels wonderfully thin. Evidence from surviving Norse myths recorded centuries later shows how deeply these stories shaped the worldview of Viking communities. Tales about Odin, Thor, and other gods helped explain natural forces such as storm seasons and fate. Even ordinary events sometimes gained meaning through these narratives. When thunder echoes across the valley, some people imagine Thor's hammer striking the sky. When ravens circle overhead, they may recall the birds said to carry Odin's thoughts across the world. The storyteller pauses and takes a slow drink of ale before continuing. This time his voice lowers slightly as he describes a quiet moment in the tale. The hero of the story sits beside a fire, much like this one, listening to the wind outside his home, while thinking about the journey still waiting beyond the horizon. The room grows quiet. For a moment, everyone seems lost in their own thoughts. Stories have that power. They carry listeners far beyond the walls of the longhouse. Researchers examining Viking social life often emphasize how storytelling reinforced shared identity within communities. By repeating the same stories across generations, families built a sense of connection to their ancestors and their past. The final part of the story ends with laughter rather than danger. The hero returns home safely. The room relaxes again. Someone tosses another piece of wood into the fire. Sparks rise briefly before fading into the smoke that drifts upward through the roof vent. Outside, the stars shine brighter than before. Inside the longhouse, voices grow softer as the evening slowly drifts toward night. The stories have been told, and their echoes linger warmly in the quiet air. The stories fade slowly into comfortable silence as the fire settles into a steady glow. Outside the longhouse, the valley rests beneath a wide sky filled with quiet stars. The fjord reflects their faint light like a sheet of dark glass, barely disturbed by the slow movement of water against the shore. Inside the hall, the warmth from the hearth keeps the night air at bay. The visitors lean back along the wooden benches, speaking more softly now as the energy of storytelling gives way to quieter conversation. The farmer reaches forward and adds another piece of wood to the fire. The flames rise briefly, illuminating the faces gathered around the room. This gentle moment often becomes a time when people speak about things that cannot easily be seen or touched. Beliefs. For the people living in Viking Age Norway, the world is filled with more than just land, water, and sky. Invisible forces move quietly through nature. Many Norse people believed that gods watched over human lives from a realm known as Asgard. Among them were figures such as Odin, the wise wanderer who sought knowledge, and Thor, the powerful protector, whose hammer controlled thunder and lightning. Material uncovered from Viking graves and settlements indicates that religious beliefs were deeply woven into daily life. Small carved figures, ritual objects, and symbolic decorations appear in many archaeological sites. These objects suggest that spiritual practice existed not only in grand temples, but also within ordinary homes. One of the visitors reaches into a small pouch hanging from his belt. He removes a pendant shaped like a tiny hammer and holds it briefly near the firelight. The children immediately recognise the shape, Thor's hammer. This symbol appears frequently in Viking Age artefacts and is widely understood to represent protection and strength. Some pendants were worn around the neck as personal amulets. Others may have been placed in graves to accompany the dead on their journey to the next world. The visitor explains that he carries the pendant during long travels across the sea. Storms can appear quickly along the Norwegian coast, and sailors often welcomed any protection they believed might help them survive dangerous waters. The woman listens quietly while continuing to tidy the bowls and cups along the table. For many families, belief in gods and spirits exists alongside everyday responsibilities without causing conflict. You notice how naturally these ideas fit into the conversation. No one argues about them. They simply exist as part of the world. A small but intriguing discovery made by archaeologists is that some Viking homes appear to contain tiny carved wooden figures placed near doorways or hearths. These may have represented household spirits or protective beings watching over the family. The practice suggests that spiritual belief extended into the most ordinary corners of daily life. The farmer leans forward slightly and points toward the doorway. Outside, the night wind rustles the grass covering the roof. He mentions quietly that some people believe hidden beings live within the hills and forests beyond the farm, creatures sometimes called land spirits. Whether people truly believed in such beings or simply respected the power of nature remains difficult to determine today. Researchers studying Norse folklore continue exploring how much of these traditions were genuine spiritual beliefs and how much reflected symbolic ways of understanding the natural world. The truth may vary from one community to another. The children listen carefully. Stories about hidden beings living in rocks or forests have a powerful hold on young imaginations. The boy glances toward the dark doorway as if half expecting something mysterious to appear in the shadows. The visitor laughs gently and assures him that most spirits prefer to remain unseen. Outside, the night remains peaceful. A faint breeze carries the smell of salt from the fjord into the valley. Inside the longhouse, the fire continues burning softly. Another topic soon enters the conversation: fate. In Norse belief systems, the idea of destiny held strong meaning. Many stories describe the Norns' mysterious figures said to shape the threads of human fate. Their work was often imagined as weaving the lives of individuals much like threads on a loom. Once woven, the pattern could rarely be changed. Some scholars examining Viking mythology suggest that this concept of fate may have helped people accept the uncertainties of life in a harsh environment. Storms, illness, and accidents could strike without warning. Believing that certain events were part of a larger pattern might have offered comfort in difficult times. The farmer listens quietly to these thoughts, while the firelight flickers across the carved beams above. Outside, the stars continue shining over the fjord. The world feels calm tonight. Inside the longhouse, belief, memory, and quiet conversation weave together just like threads on a loom. And the ancient stories of gods and unseen forces drift gently through the warm night air. The night deepens outside the longhouse, yet the fire inside still glows warmly at the centre of the room. Shadows flicker along the wooden beams as the flames shift and settle. The visitors remain seated along the benches, their voices calm and steady, as the conversation turns toward quieter matters. You notice that the farmer has placed a small wooden bowl near the edge of the hearth. It contains a few pieces of bread and a splash of ale. At first the gesture seems casual, but the way he sets the bowl carefully beside the fire suggests something more deliberate. Offerings like this sometimes appear in Norse households as small acts of respect toward unseen forces. Material uncovered from Viking Age farm sites indicates that ritual behaviour was not limited to large ceremonial places. Archaeologists have found evidence suggesting that spiritual practices often took place within homes and farmyards. Simple actions, such as leaving food near a hearth or placing objects beside important household spaces, may have carried symbolic meaning. The woman notices the bowl and nods quietly. No explanation is needed. One of the visitors mentions that tomorrow he plans to travel into the forest to leave an offering at a sacred grove located beyond the valley. Sacred groves appear frequently in descriptions of early Norse religious practices. These wooded areas sometimes served as gathering places where communities performed rituals or asked for blessings from the gods. Written sources recorded centuries later describe such locations as spaces where people honoured divine powers connected to nature. The visitor explains that the grove he plans to visit lies beside an old oak tree near a spring. Places where water emerges from the earth often held spiritual importance. Many cultures across northern Europe associated springs and wells with sacred power. You imagine the quiet clearing he describes. Tall trees forming a natural circle, sunlight filtering through branches. The sound of water moving gently through the stones. Ritual spaces like that might feel peaceful rather than dramatic. Inside the longhouse, the children listen closely. The girl asks what kind of offering will be left at the grove. The visitor smiles and replies that it may be a piece of bread, perhaps a little honey, or even a carved object made for the purpose. Offerings did not always need to be valuable. The act itself carried meaning. A small but fascinating discovery made by archaeologists involves deposits of everyday items placed intentionally in lakes or wetlands during the Viking Age. Objects such as tools, weapons and jewellery have been found resting beneath layers of mud where they appear to have been deliberately left. Some researchers believe these items may represent ritual offerings given to unseen powers associated with the landscape. Whether the people involved viewed these offerings as gifts to gods, spirits, or ancestors remains difficult to determine. Scholars studying early Scandinavian religion continue discussing how formalised these rituals may have been in smaller communities. Some believe large public ceremonies occurred only at major regional centres, while everyday households maintained simpler personal traditions. The farmer glances at the bowl near the fire again before returning his attention to the conversation. The small offering remains untouched. Outside, the wind moves gently across the valley. The fjord reflects the stars above like scattered silver. One of the visitors begins describing a ceremony he once witnessed during a seasonal gathering several years earlier. He speaks of a large feast held at the beginning of winter, where families gathered to thank the gods for the harvest and ask for protection during the coming cold months. Animals were sacrificed and their meat shared among the community. Ritual feasting appears frequently in historical descriptions of Norse religious life. Food offered during ceremonies often became part of communal meals that strengthened social bonds. The visitor describes torches burning in the darkness while people sang ancient verses. The children listen wide-eyed. To them, these stories feel almost magical. You imagine how powerful such gatherings must have felt for those present. A quiet valley suddenly filled with voices, firelight and shared belief. The fire in the longhouse shifts again as another piece of wood collapses into the embers. Sparks drift briefly upward before disappearing into the smoke. The bowl beside the hearth still rests quietly in place. No one touches it. Perhaps by morning the contents will be given to animals or returned to the earth. Or perhaps it simply represents a gesture of respect that requires no further explanation. Experts studying Norse spiritual traditions often emphasize how closely these beliefs remain tied to the natural world. Mountains, forests, rivers and sea all carried meaning. The valley outside the longhouse tonight likely felt alive with unseen presence to those who lived here. Yet inside the hall, the atmosphere remains calm and welcoming. The visitors speak quietly. The children grow sleepy, and the ancient rhythms of ritual and belief drift gently through the warm firelit room. The fire burns lower now, and the longhouse grows quieter as the evening slowly settles toward rest. Outside the fjord lies dark and calm beneath the stars. The visitors remain for a little while longer, speaking softly, while the children grow drowsy near the warmth of the hearth. Eventually, one of the men stands and stretches his shoulders. It is time for them to return to their farms before the night grows too deep. Farewells are simple. Hands are clasped. Quiet wishes for safe travel are exchanged. The visitors pull their cloaks around their shoulders and step outside into the cool air. For a moment, the doorway fills with the pale silver light of the moon reflecting off the fjord. Then the door closes again. The longhouse feels peaceful now, almost wrapped in silence, except for the steady crackle of the fire. The farmer looks toward the boat resting along the shore and begins speaking about something that will happen in the coming days. A voyage. Not a great expedition across the sea like the ones from earlier stories. Still, preparing a boat for travel always brings a sense of anticipation. Boats are lifelines in this landscape. Archaeological discoveries across Scandinavia show that Norse shipbuilding techniques were among the most advanced in Europe during the early medieval period. Ship remains recovered from burial sites reveal vessels constructed with remarkable precision and flexibility. These ships allowed Viking sailors to navigate shallow rivers, cross open ocean, and travel long distances along rugged coastlines. The farmer steps outside briefly and returns with a coil of rope and a bundle of cloth. You follow him toward the shore where the smaller boat rests pulled onto the stones. Moonlight reflects gently across the fjord, giving the water a faint glow. Preparing for even a short journey requires attention to many details. The rope must be checked for wear. Nets must be folded neatly. Oars must be secure and free of cracks. Salted fish and dried bread will be packed as provisions. The farmer examines the wooden hull, carefully running his hand along the planks to check for gaps where water might seep through. Viking boats used overlapping wooden boards fastened with iron rivets in a style known as clinker construction. This design allowed vessels to flex slightly with waves rather than breaking under pressure. One interesting detail noticed by maritime archaeologists is that Viking shipbuilders often selected specific types of wood for different parts of a vessel. Oak might form the sturdy keel, while lighter pine or spruce created flexible planking. This careful selection helped ships remain both strong and responsive in difficult water conditions. The children watch quietly as the farmer works. They have seen this process many times. Travel by boat forms a natural part of life along the fjord. Sometimes voyages are short trips to neighbouring farms. Other times they involve longer journeys to trade goods or visit relatives farther down the coast. The girl points toward the mast lying beside the boat. Tomorrow it will be raised again. The square sail is currently folded tightly within a cloth covering to protect it from moisture during the night. Producing a sail requires enormous effort. Textile experts studying reconstructed Viking sails estimate that weaving the cloth alone could take months of labour. Once finished, the sail might be treated with oils or animal fats to help repel water and strengthen the fibres. The farmer checks the folded sail briefly before tying the rope bundle beside it. Wind direction will determine how useful the sail becomes during the trip. If the wind moves along the fjord in the right direction, rowing can be reduced. If the air remains still, the oars must do all the work. Researchers examining Viking navigation methods continue exploring how sailors combined experienced landmarks and environmental clues to guide their journeys. Many voyages along the Norwegian coast relied heavily on knowledge of fjord shapes, island patterns, and currents that shift throughout the day. For someone raised beside these waters, the landscape itself becomes a map. You sit quietly on a flat stone near the shore while the farmer finishes checking the boat. Above you, the mountains rise dark and silent. The fjord reflects the stars like scattered sparks across its surface. A seabird calls somewhere in the distance. The farmer finally steps back and nods with quiet satisfaction. The boat is ready. Tomorrow's journey will not be dangerous if the weather remains calm. Still, every trip across open water carries a small element of uncertainty. Storms sometimes appear without warning. Fog can hide landmarks. The sea always deserves respect. The farmer secures the final rope and walks back toward the longhouse, where the firelight glows softly through the doorway. Behind you, the boat rests quietly at the edge of the water, prepared, waiting, and ready to follow the winding paths of the fjord once morning arrives. Morning arrives quietly over the fjord once again. Pale light slips down the mountain slopes and spreads slowly across the water. From the doorway of the longhouse, you can see thin mist drifting above the surface of the fjord like breath on a cold morning. The fire inside the hall has burned low during the night, leaving a bed of warm embers beneath a thin layer of ash. The woman kneels beside the hearth and stirs the coals gently with a wooden stick. Soon the familiar crackle of flames returns as fresh wood catches fire. Outside the valley begins to wake. A rooster calls from somewhere near the animal pens. Sheep move slowly across the hillside pasture, their bells ringing softly in the cool air. The farmer steps out into the yard and stretches his arms toward the sky. Today will be a day for travel along the fjord, just as he mentioned the night before. The boat waits along the shore, prepared and ready. You walk with him down the path toward the water. The grass is damp with dew and sparkles faintly as the sunlight strengthens. A thin breeze flows from the open fjord, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. The boat rests exactly where it was left the night before. The ropes remain secure. The folded sail lies protected beneath its cloth cover. Preparing for voyages across these waters has been part of Scandinavian life for generations. Excavations of Viking ship remains reveal remarkable skill in shipbuilding across the region. Vessels discovered in burial mounds and ancient harbours demonstrate how carefully Norse builders shaped hulls capable of both speed and stability. These designs allowed ships to move swiftly along coastlines while still handling the open sea when necessary. The farmer unties the rope securing the boat and pushes it gently into the water. The children carry small bundles of supplies down the path and place them inside the vessel. Dried fish, barley bread, a skin bag filled with fresh water, provisions for the journey. The sail is lifted from its covering and attached to the mast with careful knots. Its woolen surface feels thick and slightly rough when you touch it. One detail uncovered by maritime researchers suggests that Viking sails often contained tightly woven wool treated with oils to improve durability against wind and moisture. Creating such sails required enormous effort from the textile workers within farming communities. A single sail might represent the work of many hands spinning thread and weaving cloth over long periods. Once the mast stands upright and the sail is secured, the farmer studies the sky. Clouds move slowly across the mountains, but the wind appears gentle and steady. Good conditions. You push the boat away from the stones and climb aboard while the farmer settles near the stern with the steering oar. The sail rises slowly. At first, the cloth hangs loose against the mast. Then the breeze catches it and pulls the fabric outward with a soft, rustling sound. The boat begins to move. Water flows smoothly along the sides of the hull as the fjord carries you forward. Travel by sail feels different from rowing. The motion becomes quieter and more effortless, guided by the invisible force of wind rather than steady strokes of oars. Along the Norwegian coastline, sailors learn to read subtle signs in the environment to guide their journeys. Changes in wind direction, the movement of clouds, and the patterns of waves all offered clues about weather and currents. Many historians studying Viking navigation believe that experienced sailors relied heavily on this environmental knowledge rather than mechanical instruments. Generations of observation created a deep familiarity with the sea. The boat glides past rocky cliffs where seabirds nest in narrow ledges above the water. Their cries echo across the fjord. Further ahead, you notice another vessel travelling slowly along the same route. Its sail appears slightly larger, suggesting a longer journey beyond nearby farms. Trade and exploration often began with voyages just like this one. Small trips along local waterways could gradually extend into longer journeys across unfamiliar seas. Researchers continue examining how ordinary farmers balance seasonal work with opportunities for travel and trade. Some evidence suggests that certain households participated in voyages during periods when farm labour required less attention. This flexible rhythm allowed communities to combine agriculture with maritime activity. The boat moves steadily between the towering slopes of the fjord. Sunlight reflects off the water in bright flashes that dance along the wooden planks. You feel the quiet strength of the wind pushing the sail forward. The children sit near the centre of the boat, watching the shoreline drift past. Occasionally they point toward a distant farm or a flock of birds rising suddenly from the water. Life here has always been shaped by movement between land and sea. Farms provide food and shelter. Boats connect those farms to a much wider world. Ahead, the fjord opens, slightly revealing new stretches of coastline waiting beyond the next curve of mountains, and the sail continues to pull you gently onward through the calm morning air. The wind carries the boat smoothly along the fjord, and for a while no one speaks. The only sounds are the gentle pull of the sail and the quiet lap of water against the wooden hull. Above you, gulls circle lazily, their wings catching the morning light. Travel across these waters encourages patience. The mountains do not move quickly. The fjord bends slowly through the land, revealing new stretches of coastline, one curve at a time. From the boat, you can see how each valley forms its own small world, separated by forests and steep ridges, but joined together by the water. After some time, the farmer points ahead. At first, you notice only a narrow strip of shoreline where the trees grow thinner. Then, as the boat glides closer, signs of activity become visible. Several boats rest along the stones near the water. A few wooden buildings stand nearby, larger than the simple sheds surrounding most farms. Smoke rises from one roof, while people move back and forth between the shoreline and the structures. It is a small trading place. Locations like this appear at intervals along the Norwegian coast, where travel routes naturally cross. Farmers, fishermen and merchants gather here to exchange goods and news before continuing their journeys. Archaeological studies of coastal Scandinavia show that these modest trading spots eventually developed into larger market towns during later centuries. Early communities likely began just as places where travellers could meet safely beside sheltered harbours. The farmer guides the boat toward the shore. The sail is lowered slowly and folded across the mast, while the children prepare a rope to secure the boat. Soon the hull touches the stones with a soft scraping sound. You step onto the shore and take in the scene around you. Voices rise and fall across the small harbour. A man near the water lifts a basket of dried fish and carries it toward a wooden table where another trader inspects the catch carefully. Nearby, two women examine bundles of wool while discussing their quality. Trade here feels calm and practical rather than dramatic. Most exchanges involve everyday goods: grain, fish, cloth, animal skins. Findings from early Viking Age trading sites indicate that communities relied heavily on these ordinary items moving between regions. While exotic objects sometimes appeared through long-distance trade, the majority of transactions involved practical resources needed for daily life. The farmer carries one of the small sacks of barley toward a trader standing near the table. Their conversation begins with greetings before turning toward the details of the exchange. You wander slowly along the edge of the gathering. A rack of iron tools catches your attention. Several knives, axes, and small chisels lie neatly arranged on a wooden board. The blacksmith, responsible for these tools, sits nearby, shaping a glowing piece of metal with steady hammer blows. Ironwork formed a crucial part of Viking economy. Excavations from Norse settlements reveal many small smithing areas where craftsmen repaired tools and produced new blades. Because iron required specialized skills to produce, skilled smiths often travel between communities offering their services. The rhythmic sound of hammer striking metal echoes across the harbour. A small but interesting detail you notice involves the weights placed beside the trader's table. They are simple stone pieces marked with small carved lines. Such weights help merchants measure goods accurately during exchanges. Researchers studying Viking trade have found sets of standardized weights at several archaeological sites, suggesting that many traders used consistent systems when measuring valuable items like silver or spices. Even in small markets like this, one fairness in trade matters. You walk toward another stall where several colourful beads are displayed across a cloth. Their bright colours stand out against the muted tones of wood and wool surrounding them. Glass beads appear frequently in Viking archaeological discoveries. Many were imported through long trade routes connecting Scandinavia with regions far to the south and east. The trader explains that these beads arrived on a ship travelling from the Baltic coast. They will likely continue moving north along the fjords as other travellers purchase them for decoration or trade. Meanwhile, the farmer completes his exchange. The barley sack disappears into the trader's storage crate, and in return he receives a bundle of smoked meat wrapped carefully in cloth. Food preservation remains essential in this environment. Smoked or salted meat can last far longer than fresh cuts. You notice several sailors nearby preparing their vessel for departure. They secure ropes along the deck and adjust the position of their sail while discussing wind conditions. Travel never truly stops here. People arrive, others leave. The small harbour acts like a heartbeat, connecting scattered communities along the coast. Historians examining Viking trading patterns often emphasise how even modest marketplaces like this one helped weave together networks that eventually stretched across vast distances. What begins as a quiet exchange of fish and grain can become part of a much larger flow of goods moving through the northern world. The farmer signals that it's time to return. The bundles are loaded back into the boat now, joined by the smoked meat and a small pouch of metal nails purchased from the smith. You climb aboard once again as the sail is raised toward the wind. Slowly the shoreline drifts away. Behind you, the small harbour continues its quiet rhythm of trade and conversation beneath the wide northern sky. The wind carries the boat steadily away from the trading shore, and before long, the quiet harbour becomes a small shape behind you. Ahead, the fjord curves once again between steep walls of stone and forest. The sail remains full, pulling the vessel forward with a smooth, steady motion that requires very little effort from those aboard. The farmer keeps one hand on the steering oar while watching the shoreline pass by. The children sit quietly near the centre of the boat, occasionally pointing toward birds or distant farms that appear briefly between trees. Travel on these waters often brings more than goods and supplies. It also carries stories. As the boat glides along the fjord, the farmer begins speaking about a disagreement that once took place between two families living farther along the coast. His voice is calm, but the memory clearly holds meaning. The disagreement started with something simple, a damaged fence. One family claimed their cattle had wandered because the neighbouring farm failed to maintain the boundary properly. The other family insisted the animals were driven across the field deliberately. At first the argument seemed small, but tension between families can grow quickly if left unresolved. You remember the gathering at the Thing earlier in the valley, where people worked carefully to settle disputes before they became dangerous. That system exists for good reason. Historical evidence from early Scandinavian law traditions shows that Viking communities developed detailed methods for resolving conflict. Assemblies like the Thing allowed neighbours to bring disagreements before witnesses and seek judgment based on established customs. These meetings often prevented arguments from turning into long-running feuds. The farmer explains that in the case, he remembers the families eventually reached a compromise through the local assembly. Repairs were made to the fence. The grazing land was shared for the rest of the season. Peace returned. Still, not every conflict ended so smoothly. Some disputes could escalate into blood feuds that lasted many years. These conflicts sometimes involved extended families supporting one side or the other. Stories recorded later in Icelandic sagas describe how such feuds shaped entire communities for generations. Whether every detail in those stories reflects actual events remains uncertain, yet they reveal how seriously Viking society treated matters of honour and justice. The boat passes a narrow waterfall spilling down a cliffside beside the fjord. The sound of rushing water echoes across the valley. The farmer pauses his story and points toward a small patch of land near the base of the cliff, where grass grows thick beside the water. He explains that travellers sometimes stopped in places like this during longer journeys to rest their animals or gather fresh water. Natural landmarks often served as informal meeting points along travel routes. You notice a small cairn of stacked stones near the edge of the grass. Stone markers like this appear frequently across Scandinavian landscapes. Some may have guided travellers along difficult paths, while others possibly marked property boundaries or important locations. Archaeological surveys across Norway have identified many such cairns, though their original purposes are not always certain. The farmer resumes rowing for a short stretch, where the wind fades briefly between the mountain walls. The oars dip quietly into the water. You think again about the earlier conversation regarding conflict. Living in scattered farms across rugged land means neighbours must rely on each other during times of need. Winter storms, illness, or failed harvests can affect entire valleys. Because of this, preserving cooperation becomes essential. Researchers studying early Scandinavian communities often note how legal traditions helped maintain balance between personal honour and collective stability. The rules governing compensation for injury or damage formed an important part of these systems. Instead of endless revenge, communities often encouraged settlements where offenders paid compensation to those harmed. These payments helped restore peace without further violence. Of course, human emotions do not always follow rules. Anger can still flare. The farmer recalls hearing about one feud that continued for years along a distant fjord after a dispute over stolen livestock. In that case, several attempts at mediation failed before both families finally agreed to end the conflict through a negotiated settlement. Even their memories of the feud remained part of local storytelling long afterward. The wind strengthens again as the fjord widens. The sail fills and the boat accelerates slightly across the water. Sunlight glimmers along the surface like scattered coins. The farmer looks satisfied as the shoreline of the home valley begins to appear ahead. From a distance, you can already see the familiar slopes where sheep graze above the longhouse. The valley looks peaceful from this angle. No sign of the many conversations, negotiations, and compromises that quietly shape life within its fields and homes. Yet those efforts matter deeply. Because in a world where survival depends on cooperation, maintaining peace among neighbours becomes just as important as tending crops or fishing the fjord. The boat glides toward the shore, and the quiet work of community continues beneath the wide northern sky. The boat reaches the familiar shore just as the sun begins to sink behind the mountain ridge. Golden light spreads across the fjord, turning the calm water into a shimmering path that stretches toward the horizon. The sail is lowered carefully, and together you guide the vessel back onto the smooth stones where it will rest for the night. The farm looks peaceful from the shoreline. Smoke drifts slowly from the longhouse roof, and the sheep graze quietly on the hillside pasture above. Yet the farmer glances toward the darkening sky with a thoughtful expression. The seasons here never remain still for long. Soon winter will arrive. You follow him up the narrow path toward the house, while the cool evening wind moves gently through the grass. The children walk ahead, their laughter fading into the soft sounds of animals settling for the night. Preparing for winter begins long before the first snowfall. Excavations across Viking Age farmsteads reveal extensive storage systems designed to preserve food through the long cold months. Pits dug into the ground, wooden storage chests and hanging racks allowed families to keep grain-dried fish and preserved meat safe from moisture and animals. Without careful preparation, surviving a northern winter would become extremely difficult. Inside the longhouse, the woman has already begun arranging supplies along the walls. Bundles of dried herbs hang from wooden beams. Large sacks of barley rest near the storage chest. The smoked meat obtained earlier in the day now hangs from a hook near the hearth, where it will remain dry. You notice a section of the floor near the far wall where several wooden lids cover shallow pits dug into the earth. The farmer lifts one lid to show you the contents. Inside rests a layer of root vegetables gathered from the garden fields. Turnips, onions, and small cabbages lie packed carefully in cool soil to keep them fresh for as long as possible. Agricultural studies of early Scandinavian farms show that root crops often played an important role in winter diets. These vegetables could remain edible long after harvested grains and fresh foods disappeared from daily meals. The children help stack additional firewood beside the hearth. Firewood becomes precious once the valley fills with snow. During winter, the fire rarely goes out completely. It provides warmth, light, and the only reliable place for cooking inside the longhouse. Outside, the wind grows slightly stronger, rustling the turf roof above your head. You step briefly into the yard and feel the temperature dropping as evening deepens. The mountains surrounding the valley already hold shadows that seem colder than the open fjord. One interesting detail discovered by archaeologists is that some Viking farms use small stone-lined cellars built into hillsides to store food at stable temperatures. These early storage spaces worked much like modern root cellars, protecting supplies from freezing while keeping them cool. Not every farm possessed such structures, but many communities developed creative ways to manage their limited resources. The farmer joins you outside and looks toward the pasture where the sheep gather near the fence. He explains quietly that when winter storms arrive, some animals may be moved inside or into sheltered barns built beside the longhouse. Protecting livestock becomes essential during harsh weather. Animals provide milk, wool, and sometimes meat that families depend upon. You hear the distant call of a raven echoing across the valley. Birds often remain active even as daylight fades. Researchers studying climate patterns during the Viking Age continue examining how weather may have influenced farming cycles across northern Europe. Some evidence suggests periods of slightly milder climate may have supported agricultural expansion in certain regions. Still winters in Norway have always required respect. Even a mild season can bring heavy snow and freezing winds. You return inside the longhouse where the fire burns brighter again. The children sit near the hearth, carving small wooden shapes, while the woman prepares a simple evening meal. Steam rises gently from the pot. The farmer begins stacking additional sacks of grain along the wall, checking each one carefully for damage. Nothing can be wasted. Every handful of food may matter when the valley becomes buried beneath snow. You sit quietly on the bench and listen to the sounds of the house. The crackle of fire, the soft clink of bowls being arranged, the faint murmur of voices sharing plans for the weeks ahead. Outside, darkness spreads across the fjord. Inside the longhouse, preparation continues calmly. Winter may still be some distance away, but here in the valleys of Viking Age Norway, wise families always prepare long before the first snow touches the ground. The evening meal finishes quietly, and the longhouse slowly settles into the calm rhythm that follows a long day of work. Outside, darkness has fully taken hold of the valley. The fjord reflects the moon in a thin silver path that stretches toward the distant mountains. Inside, the fire glows steadily at the centre of the hall. The children gather closer to the hearth, with pieces of wool and wood scattered around them. The girl resumes practicing the spinning motion. She learned earlier in the day, twisting fibres slowly between her fingers while the spindle turns with a soft hum. The boy continues carving small shapes from a piece of scrap wood. Winter evenings often bring long hours indoors, and people use this time to create the objects they will need in the months ahead. Material remains from Viking settlements across Scandinavia suggest that winter became a season of intensive craft work. With fields buried under snow and livestock sheltered, nearby households shifted their attention toward tasks such as weaving, tool repair, and wood carving. These quiet activities help maintain the farm while waiting for the return of spring. The woman moves toward the upright loom positioned near the wall. Earlier you saw her weaving thread into cloth. Now the woven fabric has grown several hand lengths longer. She passes the shuttle through the vertical threads again and again with steady patience. The sound is soft. Thread slides across thread. Each pass strengthens the growing cloth. Textile research based on preserved fragments from Viking graves shows that woven wool garments could be remarkably durable. Some fabrics display tight, even patterns that reveal a high level of skill among early Scandinavian weavers. Clothing, blankets, sails and rope all depended on this work. Without it, life in the cold north would quickly become unbearable. The farmer sits near the workbench where he earlier carved a wooden bowl. Tonight he sharpens a small iron knife using a flat stone. The blade slides slowly across the surface with a faint scraping sound. Tools must remain ready for the next day's work. One intriguing observation made by archaeologists studying Viking craft areas is that many tools were repaired repeatedly rather than replaced. Iron was valuable, and skilled smiths were not always nearby. As a result, people learned to maintain and reshape their tools whenever possible. The children glance occasionally toward the sharpening stone, curious about the sparks that appear where metal meets rock. Across the hall, a small oil lamp burns beside the loom. Its flame flickers gently, but provides enough light for careful work. Oil lamps filled with animal fat or fish oil appear frequently in Norse archaeological sites. These lamps allow people to continue working long after sunset during the dark winter months. Outside, the wind brushes softly against the turf roof. You imagine how different this longhouse might feel when snow piles high against the walls and icy storms sweep down from the mountains. During those months, evenings like this become even more important. They provide warmth, They provide productivity, and they provide companionship. The girl pauses her spinning and lifts the growing thread to examine it in the firelight. The strand looks slightly uneven, but strong enough to continue weaving. She smiles quietly before twisting the fibres again. Learning happens slowly here. Small improvements each day lead toward real skill over time. Near the doorway, the dog sleeps peacefully curled into a circle with its nose tucked beneath its tail. Animals inside the longhouse share the warmth during colder seasons. Excavations of early medieval farmhouses have revealed clear evidence that livestock were sometimes sheltered within separate sections of the same building during harsh weather. This arrangement helped conserve heat while protecting animals from storms. Tonight the animals remain outside, but winter will eventually bring them closer. The farmer finishes sharpening the knife and tests the edge carefully against a piece of wood. Satisfied, he returns the tool to its place on the bench. The fire shifts again as a log settles deeper into the embers. Sparks rise briefly before fading into the dark space above the hearth. The room grows quieter as fatigue slowly spreads among everyone inside. The children lean against the benches, their eyes growing heavy. Outside, the wind carries the faint sound of waves touching the shore. Inside the longhouse, weaving continues for a few moments longer. Then even that sound fades. The calm patience of winter work has filled the evening, and the quiet warmth of the hearth holds the household together beneath the dark northern sky. The night passes gently, and the first light of morning slips quietly into the longhouse once again. A pale glow enters through the doorway, and the roof opening above the hearth. The fire has settled into a bed of glowing embers that give off a soft warmth across the room. The household wakes slowly. The children stir first, stretching beneath their blankets before sitting upright near the hearth. Outside, the faint sounds of animals already moving across the pasture drift through the morning air. You step outside with the farmer and feel the cool breath of the fjord valley against your face. The sky above the mountains shows a thin band of pale blue, while the rest of the world still holds on to the shadows of night. Days begin early here. There is always work waiting. Yet life in Viking Age Norway also includes moments when people must face something far less predictable than weather or harvests. Illness. You notice the farmer glancing toward one of the neighbouring houses farther up the valley. Smoke rises from its roof, but the activity around the building seems slower than usual. He explains quietly that someone there has been unwell for several days. Health in this time period depends largely on knowledge passed down through generations. Without modern medicine, families rely on herbs, traditional remedies, and the experience of those who understand the healing properties of plants. Archaeological evidence recovered from Norse settlements shows that Viking communities possessed a surprising range of herbal knowledge. Seeds and plant remains found at farm sites include species known for medicinal qualities. Plants such as yarrow, angelica and wild thyme appear frequently in these discoveries. The farmer leads you along the path toward a small garden area behind the longhouse. Here, several plants grow carefully within a patch of protected soil. The woman kneels beside them and gently gathers a handful of leaves from one plant with long, narrow stems. She explains that these herbs can be steeped in hot water to create a drink believed to ease pain or fever. Early medieval medical knowledge often blended observation with tradition. Some treatments likely helped relieve symptoms, while others carried symbolic meaning connected to spiritual beliefs. A small but fascinating detail uncovered in Norse archaeological studies involves tiny medical kits discovered in a few burial sites. These kits sometimes contain tweezers, small knives and containers that may have held healing substances. Such discoveries suggest that certain individuals within Viking communities possess specialized knowledge of treatment. The woman crushes the leaves gently between her fingers before placing them in a wooden bowl. Soon they will be added to boiling water inside the longhouse. The farmer points toward the forest edge where several tall trees grow beside a stream. He mentions that certain bark from those trees can also be used to create remedies when boiled carefully. Modern research into ancient plant use has shown that some traditional remedies may indeed have contained compounds capable of reducing pain or infection. However, many aspects of Viking healing practice remain uncertain. Researchers continue examining written sources, archaeological evidence, and plant remains to understand how effective these treatments may have been. The valley around you remains quiet while the morning light grows stronger. Sheep move slowly along the hillside while birds rise from the trees in short bursts of song. Illness may bring worry to a household, but life around it continues. You return to the longhouse, where the fire burns steadily again. The woman places the bowl of crushed herbs into a pot of water and allows it to heat slowly above the flames. Steam rises with a faint earthy scent. The children watch curiously. One of them asks if the drink will taste good. The woman smiles and explains that medicine rarely tastes pleasant. Sometimes helping someone recover requires patience more than comfort. You sit quietly near the hearth while the mixture simmers. Across the room, the farmer prepares a small cloth bundle that will carry the herbal drink to the neighbouring house once it cools. Helping neighbours during illness forms an important part of community life. Families living in scattered farms rely on each other during difficult moments. Even when knowledge of healing remains limited, kindness and care still matter. Outside, the sun finally rises above the mountain ridge. Golden light spills across the fjord and reaches the windows of the longhouse. Another day has begun. Work will continue. Animals must be fed. Fields must be checked. But for now, the quiet preparation of a simple herbal remedy reminds you that survival in this world depends not only on strength and labour, it also depends on compassion shared between neighbours beneath the wide northern sky. The day moves forward with its usual quiet rhythm. Sunlight climbs over the mountain ridge and spreads across the fjord, turning the water bright and reflective. The herbal drink prepared earlier has already been carried to the neighbouring house, and the farm returns to its familiar pattern of work and calm conversation. But as the afternoon settles into a softer light, the valley grows unusually quiet. Word travels along the narrow paths between farms. Someone has died. You notice the change almost immediately. Voices near the longhouse lower into respectful tones. The farmer stands near the doorway, speaking with a man who has just arrived from the neighbouring farm farther up the slope. The children remain silent for once. In small communities like this, news of death touches everyone. You follow the farmer up the path toward the neighbouring house. The air feels still, and even the sheep grazing nearby seem quieter than before. Outside the longhouse, several people stand together in quiet conversation. No one speaks loudly. A few nod in greeting as you arrive. Inside, the atmosphere feels calm but heavy with emotion. The body of the deceased lies on a wooden bench covered with a woven blanket. Nearby, a small oil lamp burns gently beside the head of the bench. Family members sit close, speaking softly with those who have come to offer comfort. Death was an ever-present part of life in the Viking Age. Average life expectancy during early medieval times was far lower than what people experience today. Hard labour, illness and accidents often shortened lives across farming communities. Archaeological examination of Viking burial sites has revealed remains of individuals of many different ages, showing how common it was for people to face mortality at earlier stages of life. Yet the way communities responded to death shows care and dignity. The woman of the house has placed several objects beside the body: a carved wooden bowl, a small knife, a cloak folded neatly. Grave goods such as these appear frequently in Norse burials uncovered across Scandinavia. These items may have been included to accompany the deceased into the next stage of existence. Beliefs about the afterlife varied within Viking society. Some traditions spoke of warriors travelling to Valhalla, the Hall of Odin, where fallen heroes continued their battles and feasts. Others believed the dead journeyed to quieter realms, such as a hell, or remained connected to the land of their ancestors. The exact nature of these beliefs likely differed between communities. Researchers examining Norse religious traditions continue discussing how widely certain afterlife ideas were shared among ordinary farming families compared with elite warrior groups. For most people here, death appears to be treated less as a dramatic event and more as a natural passage. The body will soon be prepared for burial. One man carefully washes the hands of the deceased, while another adjusts the cloak resting across the chest. You notice that the oil lamp remains burning steadily beside the bench. A small but interesting detail recorded in several Scandinavian burial traditions involves the presence of light near the body before burial. Some historians believe lamps or fires symbolized guidance for the spirit beginning its journey. Outside preparations quietly begin. Several men walk toward a patch of open ground near the edge of the field where the burial will take place. The soil there appears soft enough to dig. In other regions of the Viking world, elaborate burial mounds sometimes covered the graves of important individuals. Ship burials have also been discovered in certain locations where the deceased was laid to rest within a vessel along with valuable objects. Such dramatic ceremonies likely belonged mostly to wealthy leaders or warriors. For ordinary farmers, burial customs were usually simpler. Excavations of rural Scandinavian graves often reveal modest burial pits containing practical belongings and personal items. The farmer steps outside and begins helping dig the grave. The work proceeds quietly with steady movements of shovels cutting into the soil. The children remain near the longhouse, watching respectfully from a distance. The valley continues its calm existence around the gathering. Birds cross the sky. Wind moves through the grass. The fjord glimmers beyond the fields. Life does not stop entirely even in the presence of death. Eventually, the grave reaches the proper depth. The body is carried slowly from the house and lowered gently into the earth. Several people place small objects beside the body before soil is returned carefully over the grave. No loud ceremony, no long speeches, just quiet respect. Some families may recite words or prayers during such moments, but here the silence itself seems meaningful enough. The mound of fresh soil rises slightly above the ground. Soon grass will grow across it, blending the resting place into the surrounding field. Archaeological studies of Viking burial landscapes have revealed that many graves were marked with simple stones or small mounds rather than elaborate monuments. Memory rather than stone often preserved the stories of those who had lived. As the gathering slowly disperses, people return to their farms in thoughtful silence. The farmer walks beside you back toward the longhouse. The sun begins its slow descent toward the mountains once again. Another life has ended. Yet the valley continues. The fjord continues, and the quiet rhythm of Viking Age Norway moves forward beneath the wide northern sky. The valley remains unusually quiet after the burial. Even as people return to their homes and fields, a thoughtful calm lingers in the air. You walk back toward the longhouse with the farmer while the sun lowers slowly behind the mountains. Life continues. It always does. Sheep still graze along the hillside, their bells ringing softly as they wander through the grass. Smoke rises once again from the roof of the longhouse as the woman prepares the evening meal. Yet moments like the one you witnessed leave an imprint on the community. The farmer pauses for a moment beside the fence, overlooking the fjord. From here, the water stretches far into the distance, disappearing between tall cliffs that guard the entrance to the open sea. Beyond those cliffs lies a wider world. during the Viking Age, the wider world was slowly changing. Archaeological discoveries across Scandinavia reveal increasing contact between Norse communities and distant regions throughout the early medieval centuries. Trade networks connected Norway with the British Isles, the Baltic coast, and lands far beyond. Silver coins from the Middle East, glass from southern Europe, and exotic fabrics have all been uncovered in Scandinavian burial sites. These objects remind you that even quiet valleys like this one were never completely isolated. Ships arriving along the coast carried more than goods. They carried ideas. The farmer speaks about travellers who occasionally bring news from far away. Some speak of new rulers in distant lands. Others describe unfamiliar customs spreading through trading towns. Among those changes is something many people in the north are only beginning to hear about: a new religion, Christianity. At this time, many Norse communities still follow their traditional beliefs, centered on gods such as Odin and Thor. Sacred groves offerings and seasonal rituals remain part of everyday life. But stories from travellers suggest that Christian beliefs are spreading gradually across parts of Europe. Missionaries, traders, and kings in distant lands encourage the new faith. Some Scandinavian leaders will eventually adopt it as well. Historians studying this transition often describe it as a slow and uneven process. In some areas, Norse traditions remained strong for generations, while Christian influence gradually increased through trade and political alliances. The valley around you still feels deeply rooted in the older traditions. Thor's hammer pendants hang around necks. Offerings rest quietly beside hearth fires. Yet the winds of change travel along the same sea routes that carry merchants and explorers. Inside the longhouse, the evening meal is nearly ready. You step through the doorway and feel the warmth of the hearth once again. The children sit along the bench, whispering to each other, while the woman places bowls along the table. The farmer hangs his cloak and glances once more toward the fjord before joining them. One interesting detail uncovered by archaeologists studying later Viking Age graves is the gradual appearance of Christian symbols alongside older Norse objects. In some burial sites, crosses appear beside traditional grave goods. These discoveries suggest that belief systems may have overlapped for a time as communities adapted to changing influences. Cultural transformation rarely happens overnight. Instead, it moves slowly through everyday interactions between travellers, traders, and neighbours. You sit down with the others as the bowls of stew are passed around. The meal feels familiar now. Barley, fish, herbs gathered from nearby fields. Outside, the valley darkens gradually as evening returns. The fjord reflects the fading light while seabirds settle along the rocky shoreline. Despite the quiet changes taking place in the wider world, life here still follows the same patterns that have guided generations before. Fields must be planted. Animals must be cared for. Boats must be repaired. The fire crackles gently while the farmer speaks about plans for tomorrow's work. A fence needs fixing near the pasture. Fishing nets must be checked again along the fjord. Simple tasks, steady tasks. They anchor life in this place. Researchers studying Viking Age rural communities often emphasise how much of daily life remained stable even during periods of broader historical change. Large political shifts might reshape distant kingdoms, but farms like this continued operating according to seasonal rhythms and local traditions. Outside, the stars begin appearing above the mountains. Inside the longhouse, conversation softens into quiet evening comfort. The valley rests peacefully beneath the night sky. And somewhere beyond the fjord's distant cliffs, the currents of history continue moving slowly toward the shores of Norway. The night settles gently over the valley once again. The fjord outside reflects a soft scatter of stars, and the longhouse grows quiet as the last embers of the evening fire glow warmly in the centre of the room. The bowls from supper have been set aside. The children have already drifted into sleep beneath their blankets. You remain seated near the hearth while the farmer quietly places another small log onto the coals. The flames rise briefly, then calm again into a slow, steady glow. Life here moves in cycles that repeat day after day. Morning work in the fields, journeys along the fjord, meals shared around the fire, stories told beneath the roof while wind moves softly through the valley. When you think back across the days you have spent here, a picture of Viking Age life begins to form. It is not only a world of ships and warriors, as many later stories imagine, it is a world built from quieter things. Families, work, community. Archaeological investigations of Norse farmsteads across Norway consistently reveal how central agriculture remained to everyday life. Longhouses stood at the heart of small farming communities, where livestock crops and household crafts supported survival through difficult climates. The dramatic voyages remembered in sagas were only one part of a much larger reality. Most people living in Viking Age Norway spent their lives tending animals, harvesting grain, weaving cloth, and maintaining the fragile balance between human effort and nature's demands. You look toward the doorway where a faint breeze carries the scent of salt from the fjord. Those waters have carried traders, explorers, and storytellers across enormous distances, yet they have also quietly sustained families who depend on fishing and travel between neighbouring valleys. The farmer sits across from you, his expression calm in the flickering light. His life has likely followed patterns similar to the ones you have witnessed. Seasons of planting, seasons of harvest. Winter evenings filled with weaving and carving. Researchers studying early medieval Scandinavia often emphasize how closely daily survival depended on cooperation within small communities. Farms rarely existed in complete isolation. Shared labour assemblies for dispute resolution and gatherings for trade helped maintain stability in a challenging environment. Without such cooperation, even the strongest household would struggle. You hear the distant call of a seabird echo across the fjord. The sound fades quickly into the quiet night. The valley feels peaceful. One intriguing observation from archaeological work involves the way Viking farms were positioned carefully within the landscape. Many settlements appear located where freshwater grazing land and access to the sea all meet within a manageable distance. These choices allowed families to balance farming with fishing and travel. The farmer eventually rises and steps outside for a moment. You follow him into the cool night air. Above you, the sky stretches wide and clear, filled with more stars than you can easily count. The mountains surrounding the valley stand like dark guardians against the horizon. The fjord reflects the sky so clearly that the boundary between water and stars becomes almost invisible. Moments like this remind you how deeply people living here must have felt connected to the natural world. The cycles of weather, the turning of seasons, the quiet presence of sea and mountain. Historians continue exploring how this environment shaped the culture and beliefs of Viking communities. Some suggest that the challenges of northern landscapes encourage resilience and adaptability among those who lived here. Others emphasize how access to waterways opened opportunities for travel that reshaped the history of Europe. Perhaps both ideas contain some truth. The farmer looks across the fjord once more before turning back toward the warm glow of the longhouse. Inside, the fire has settled into soft red embers. The room feels calm and welcoming. You lie down near the hearth where warmth spreads slowly across the floor. The sounds of the valley grow quieter as the night deepens. Outside, the wind brushes gently through the grass covering the roof. Inside the longhouse, the steady breathing of those asleep blends with the faint crackle of the fading fire. Your thoughts begin to drift across the memories of this place. The smell of fresh wood being carved, the sound of sails catching wind along the fjord, the quiet voices sharing stories beneath firelight. Life in Viking Age Norway may appear distant from the modern world, yet its rhythms feel strangely familiar. People rising with the sun, working together to survive, finding warmth in simple gatherings at the end of long days. The embers glow softer now. The valley rests, and beneath the endless northern sky, the quiet world of the Viking farm slowly fades into peaceful sleep. Now as the fire settles into its final gentle glow, the valley becomes very still. The fjord outside reflects the quiet stars like scattered lights resting upon dark water. The mountains surrounding the farm stand silent and patient, just as they have for countless generations. Inside the longhouse, the warmth of the hearth lingers softly. You hear only the calm breathing of those sleeping nearby, and the occasional whisper of wind against the turf roof above. Your body feels heavy with the peaceful rhythm of the day that has passed. The steady work in the fields, the slow movement of the boat across the fjord, the gentle sounds of weaving and carving beside the fire, all of it settles quietly in your mind like drifting snow. In this distant time, life moves without hurry. Morning arrives with the sun over the mountains. Evening returns with the quiet glow of the hearth. Days unfold through work, community, and the steady presence of nature all around. As you rest here in the warmth of the longhouse, the outside world grows softer and more distant. The fjord continues its slow breathing beneath the stars. The valley sleeps, and the long journey through Viking Age Norway gently fades into silence. Sweet dreams.